What if America had royalty? Not crowns and thrones, contracts, foundations, family trusts, no castles, just skyscrapers, no kings, just surnames, Adams, Kennedy, Rockefeller, Mars. In a country that swears it has no aristocracy, 25 families quietly inherited the power, wealth, and mythos of monarchs and built dynasties stronger than law. Some ruled through ballots, others through oil, sugar, or silence. But they all share one thing: they never really left. Welcome to the families who own America's past and its future. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button if you're into long-form mysteries, forgotten power, and the stories hiding in plain sight. It helps the channel more than you know. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it right now? Midnight in Boston? Lunch break in Manila? Let's see how far this royal court really stretches. 1. Adams. In the beginning, America didn't have royalty, so it made its own. And like all true monarchies, it started with lawyers. The Adams family of Massachusetts wasn't just one of the first political dynasties in American history. They were the prototype, the blueprint, a lineage that began with ideas and ended in institutions. No crowns, no castles, just Harvard degrees, handwritten constitutions, and a generational compulsion to write extremely long letters. Public service, debats, wasn't just encouraged in this family, it was practically genetic. But behind their Puritan discipline and powdered wigs was a darker truth. The Adamses were brilliant, but they were never built to win. It began with John Adams, the lawyer with the soul of a philosopher and the haircut of a powdered judge. He defended British soldiers in court after the Boston Massacre, not exactly a popular move in revolutionary Boston, and then went on to help draft the Declaration of Independence. He later became the first vice president and second president of the United States. But John Adams didn't have the charm of Washington, nor the revolutionary panache of Jefferson. He had, well, books and principles, and the uncanny ability to make enemies without trying. He died on the 4th of July, same as Jefferson, an eerie symmetry befitting a man obsessed with posterity. Then came his son, John Quincy Adams. You know, the other Adams president, the one you probably forgot. He spoke multiple languages, negotiated treaties in his teens, and as president, he pushed for infrastructure, science, and education before it was cool. He was too smart to be popular, too stubborn to play the game, and too puritanical to enjoy the spoils of power. His presidency was one long chess match in a room full of poker players. And then, like all second acts in American dynasties, came the slow fade. Charles Francis Adams, the third in the line, didn't make it to the presidency, but he did keep the family name alive through diplomacy, serving as Lincoln's ambassador to Britain during the Civil War. It was a critical role. He kept the British from recognizing the Confederacy, largely by scowling in perfect iambic pentameter. He was effective, stern, and predictably overshadowed. From there, the dynasty gradually descended into a kind of respectable irrelevance. Future Adamses went on to become historians, professors, and minor intellectuals. Useful, thoughtful, forgotten, which is perhaps the perfect curse for a family obsessed with legacy, to be remembered only by the people who read footnotes. Unlike later dynasties, the Adams family never traded in spectacle. They wore their virtue like armor and their intellect like a family crest. But in a country increasingly allergic to elitism and allergic to restraint, that became their downfall. America loves its royals loud, glamorous, or dead. The Adamses were none of these. They were noble in the old-fashioned way, serious, self-sacrificing, and a little bit exhausting. They believed in a republic of laws, but the country was already dreaming of a republic of personalities. And so the Adams name receded into the background, enshrined in statues, buried in archives, and eventually taught in the kind of college classes where students quietly Google whether John Quincy and John were actually related. They were. painfully so. Today, the Adams family isn't invoked like the Kennedys or the Bushes. They don't show up in campaign ads or guest star on talk shows or inherit oil empires, but walk through Boston's old cemeteries or step into Harvard's libraries, and their fingerprints are everywhere. A ghostly reminder that American royalty once came in the form of stern fathers, morally rigid sons, and a belief that integrity mattered more than charisma, which might be why their dynasty didn't survive the age of cameras. But legacy, like lineage, has a funny way of echoing. Because as the Adams line faded into the quiet corridors of history, another family was just beginning to stir in the Virginia tidewater. A clan with land, bloodlines, and an affinity for command. A family that didn't build the country, but ruled over the parts that tried to leave it. A family that would eventually produce a man Americans would both idolize and regret idolizing. They were older than the Revolution, steeped in plantations and proud of it. They were the Harrisons. 2. Harrison, before there was a White House, there was Berkeley Plantation. Before there were founding fathers, there were founding landlords. And before the American Republic even knew what kind of government it wanted, the Harrison family of Virginia already had a seat at the table, because technically they'd built the table and possibly owned the wood. The Harrisons weren't just early, they were foundational, colonial royalty with a direct pipeline from Jamestown to Washington, D.C., long before D.C. had any buildings worth fighting over. Their story reads like a family Bible soaked in gunpowder and tobacco, verses about duty, legacy, and the unspoken assumption that politics was best left to men with inherited land and unpaid labor. And it all starts with Benjamin Harrison V, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the kind of man whose Roman numeral wasn't just decorative. He was loud, unfiltered, and unimpressed by his more philosophically inclined colleagues. John Adams once described him as another Sir John Falstaff, which, for those less familiar with Shakespearean insults, is the 18th century version of calling someone a drunken linebacker with a powdered wig. Benjamin was a patriot in the most transactional sense, liberty for his class, order for his land, and independence because Britain wasn't sending enough respect or enough shipping contracts. He was governor of Virginia, head of a sprawling estate, and so committed to American self-rule that he taught it directly to his son, one generation ahead of the curriculum. That son was William Henry Harrison, the 9th President of the United States, a former general and the first man to die in office. But more on that in a moment. William Henry didn't grow up in hardship. He was born into one of Virginia's most prominent families, educated in the classics and destined for public life. But he wanted to make his own mark, so he headed west to the Ohio frontier, where American ambition went to prove itself with muskets and manifest destiny. He became a soldier, then a governor, then a folk hero. His victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe launched 1,000 campaign slogans and more than a few historical disclaimers. By the time he ran for president in 1840, William Henry Harrison had been remade into a log cabin populist, even though his childhood home had, among other things, columns. The Whigs spun his narrative like cotton. The rugged Indian fighter, the humble man of the people, the whiskey-drinking war hero who slept on the floor just like you, dear voter. It was electoral theatre, deeply inaccurate, wildly successful, and quintessentially American. He won in a landslide. Then he gave the longest inaugural address in history, in the cold, without a coat. 1 month later, he was dead. The official cause was pneumonia. The unofficial cause was hubris. His death created a constitutional crisis, jump-started the conversation about presidential succession, and gave America its first real taste of what dynasties cost. It also cut short the Harrison political arc, temporarily, because the real legacy would emerge nearly 50 years later through another Harrison with the same jawline, same bloodline, and a very different moment in history. Benjamin Harrison, the grandson, was not a war hero. He was a lawyer, a senator, a civil servant in the age of railroads and Reconstruction. But the family name still carried weight, and in 1888 it carried him all the way to the presidency. Barely. He lost to the popular vote to Grover Cleveland, but won the Electoral College, an outcome that Americans today are depressingly familiar with. Benjamin was quiet, diligent, and deeply religious. He wasn't flashy and he wasn't scandalous. He supported civil rights in theory, but hesitated in practice. He pushed for modern infrastructure and an expanded navy. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act and oversaw the admission of 6 new states. But ask most people to describe him today, and you'll get a blank stare if you're lucky. That's the curse of the middle-tier president. Too competent to be mocked, too restrained to be remembered. But dynasties don't need applause. They just need access. And the Harrisons had it for nearly 2 centuries. From the colonial legislature to the Senate floor, from independence to industrialism, the family never lost its proximity to power. They didn't build empires like the Rockefellers or televise tragedies like the Kennedys, but they were there, always a seat at the table, always a Harrison with a handshake, always a cousin ready to run for something. If the Adams family was America's moral compass, the Harrisons were its long game. Less about brilliance, more about durability. The kind of dynasty that treats history like farmland, inherited, fenced off, and kept in the family. And yet, by the 20th century, their name had all but vanished from headlines. The plantations were sold, the public offices handed to new names, and the idea of old Virginia nobility faded into nostalgic fiction. But royalty never dies, it just migrates. Because while the Harrisons proved that longevity can be earned in generations, the next family proved it could be manufactured in branches. 2 of them, each carrying the weight of an entire century. One brash and bellicose, the other cerebral and cripplingly noble. Together they turned politics into theater and family into brand. And their last name, Roosevelt. 2 families down, 23 to go. And we're just getting started. If you're still with us, you're clearly one of the curious ones. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? What time is it right now? 3 a.m. in Chicago, sunset in Johannesburg. Let's see who else is wandering the halls of power with us tonight. 3. Roosevelt. You could argue that the Roosevelt family didn't just bend the American century to their will, they produced it, like a pair of overachieving blacksmiths hammering reality into a family crest. Not 1, but 2 presidents, 2 completely different branches, and one legendary First Lady who had more moral authority than most men in her era could buy with a fleet of battleships. The Roosevelts were never just politicians, they were a mythology with tailored suits. Oyster Bay and Hyde Park, 2 lines, 2 visions, 1 surname that came to symbolize the high water mark of American ambition dressed in noble intentions. And of course, a touch of delusion. Let's start with the Oyster Bay side, the Rough Rider himself, Theodore Roosevelt. A man who once described his own life as if he were writing a boy's adventure novel about himself. Born into New York aristocracy in 1858, young Theodore was sickly, asthmatic, and dangerously curious. Instead of succumbing to the era's usual prescription of quiet invalidity, he decided to build his body like a one-man civil engineering project. He lifted weights, boxed, rode horses, and developed the kind of performative masculinity that would later sell millions of war posters. He went to Harvard, of course, spoke with a clipped upper-class accent naturally, then charged headlong into politics before he was legally old enough to rent a hotel room today. He was a New York state legislator by 23, a reformer by instinct, and a moralist by compulsion. But tragedy struck early. His first wife and his mother died on the same day, in the same house. In his diary, he drew a large black X and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." So he did what emotionally repressed men with trust funds often do. He went west to reinvent himself. Cowboy, rancher, sheriff, writer, legend. He wore many hats, literally and metaphorically, and emerged not as a man who fled grief, but one who marketed it. The war with Spain gave him his next costume, Colonel of the Rough Riders. He stormed up San Juan Hill with a press corps in tow and emerged a national hero. From there it was inevitable. Governor of New York, vice president then, after McKinley was conveniently assassinated, president at just 42, the youngest in history. His presidency was a blend of progressive reform and imperial swagger. He busted trusts while building battleships, spoke softly and carried an absurdly large stick, and decided that if the Constitution didn't say he couldn't do something, he probably should. He left office, went on safari, got bored, tried to come back, split the Republican vote, and handed the White House to Woodrow Wilson. Even in defeat, Theodore was victorious in narrative. His legacy wasn't just leadership, it was myth-making. But then came Hyde Park, and a very different Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Theodore's fifth cousin, was softer in voice, colder in calculation, and infinitely more durable. He grew up idolizing his cousin, married Theodore's niece, Eleanor, and patterned much of his early political persona off the Oyster Bay model. But where Theodore was kinetic, Franklin was strategic. Where Theodore wrestled bears, Franklin wrestled systems. He contracted polio at 39, which left him paralyzed from the waist down, a fact the press, under a gentleman's agreement soaked in denial, largely ignored. He taught himself to walk short distances using braces and canes and trained his body to seem mobile in public. The illusion became part of the brand: strength, courage, unflappability. He ran for president in 1932 at the peak of the Great Depression and promised a New Deal, a phrase so vague it was practically a blank check. America signed it anyway. Then came the alphabet soup of reform agencies, Social Security, bank holidays, fireside chats, and a country slowly dragged back from the brink by a man who couldn't walk. He didn't just change the scope of government, he redefined its purpose. For better or worse, depending on your tax bracket. Then came World War II, and Roosevelt became the wartime president who never saw the end of his war. He was elected 4 times, an act of either desperate trust or collective madness, and died just months before the Axis fell. His legacy was a new America, globally ascendant, domestically re-engineered, and permanently centralized. And then there was Eleanor. Let's be clear, Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't a first lady. She was a political movement wrapped in pearls, or perhaps barbed wire wrapped in velvet. She wrote daily columns, traveled independently, pushed civil rights when it was politically suicidal, and called out hypocrisy like it was a family tradition. Her marriage to Franklin was strained, distant, and let's say pragmatic. But their partnership was formidable, if not romantic. By the time she died, Eleanor had already become a post-presidency prophet. She didn't just survive the Roosevelt dynasty, she outgrew it. So what do you call a family that spans both wings of the same political bird, that embodies both action and analysis, both war and welfare, both reform and control? You call them the Roosevelts, and you say it with a mix of awe and fatigue. Their story was dynastic, not just because they held power, but because they created roles that others have spent decades failing to fill. Theodore was the action hero, Franklin the architect, Eleanor the conscience, and between them they turned the 20th century into a Roosevelt century, narrated, designed, and morally litigated from Hyde Park and Oyster Bay. But every empire, even the well-dressed kind, eventually runs out of heirs or oxygen, and waiting in the wings was a new kind of dynasty, flashier, flashbulb-ready, and fated to end in both triumph and tragedy. They weren't born of Oyster Bay drawing rooms or Hudson Valley estates. They were born in Boston, baptized in ambition, and soon the American dream would have a new surname, Kennedy, for Kennedy. The Kennedys didn't just walk into American royalty, they arrived like a cinematic prophecy, glowing, loud, Irish, and just suspiciously lucky enough to feel cursed from the beginning. They were the first truly modern political dynasty, not because they held power, but because they sold it. The Roosevelts had radio, the Kennedys had television. The Roosevelts gave speeches, the Kennedys gave glamour, and while other dynasties wrote history, the Kennedys knew how to frame it, literally, in portraits, photo ops, and full-color funeral processions. At the center of it all was Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a stock market magician, liquor distributor, and diplomat who never met a system he couldn't manipulate or a headline he couldn't edit. He built a fortune during Prohibition and the Depression, mastered both the art of the inside deal and the illusion of outsider charm, and set about building what he called, without irony, a dynasty of winners. He didn't want power for himself, he wanted it for his sons. That alone made him a rare figure in American elite circles, a patriarch who invested in ambition like it was a family hedge fund. He was determined that one of his boys would become president. That was the plan. That was always the plan. At first, that child was Joe Jr., the golden son, the war hero in training. But when he died in World War II, the ambition was handed down to the second-born, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Less dutiful, more charming, constantly ill, dangerously charismatic. A man who never expected to live a long life and carried himself accordingly, with the recklessness of someone racing against fate. He served in the Navy, was nearly killed in the Pacific, wrote a best-selling book about courage, and ran for Congress just in time to beat the whisper of nepotism to the punch. By 1952, he was a senator. By 1960, he was the youngest elected president in American history. The world didn't just watch, it leaned in. John F. Kennedy's presidency was many things: short, dazzling, frustratingly incomplete. He launched the Peace Corps, stared down the Soviets in Cuba, began the American lurch towards civil rights, and promised a moon landing like it was the next logical stop on the subway. He was polished, brilliant, and aloof. His administration became Camelot, on the record, off the rails, and hopelessly romanticized. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't pretending to be. But he looked like the future, and in America, that's often enough. Then came Dallas, and for a moment, history seemed to hit pause, not just on a presidency, but on a family myth in mid-sentence. The nation watched a widow in a blood-stained pink suit, a young son saluting a coffin, and a dream implode on live television. It wasn't just grief, it was branding, a visual vocabulary of tragedy that would define the Kennedys forever. But dynasties, like ghosts, don't vanish. They haunt. Enter Robert F. Kennedy, Jack's younger brother, former Attorney General, moral crusader, and lightning rod of late 60s unrest. Where Jack was calculated, Bobby was combustible. He began his career as a cold operative, the enforcer of Camelot's dark compromises. But after his brother's death, something in him cracked or ignited. He ran for president in 1968, not just as a candidate, but as a symbol of something unspoken, a lost future trying to claw its way back into the present. He talked about poverty, race, war, and moral responsibility like they were personal debts. He didn't just campaign, he confessed, and America, exhausted by its own contradictions, leaned in once again. But the story ended again in sudden silence. Another brother gone, another black and white funeral, another generation told to believe in hope, with teeth marks in it. And still, the family persisted. Ted Kennedy, the youngest brother, spent nearly 50 years in the Senate. His was a legacy of policy over poetry, health care reform, labor rights, education funding, the less glamorous, more durable bricks of governance. But the weight of the family myth and the shadows of its losses never left him. His own missteps, most famously at Chappaquiddick, ensured that the presidency would remain just out of reach. The Kennedy dynasty didn't end, it simply recalibrated. It moved into ambassadorships, house seats, foundations, and quiet tragedies. The newer generations bore the name like a fragile relic, valuable, symbolic, and occasionally cursed. The glint of old charisma still flickers through the occasional campaign photo, the op-ed, the eulogy. But the magic, that's been embalmed in grainy footage and Frank Sinatra ballads. No other American family has been so fully mythologized while still being technically alive. The Kennedys weren't about governance, they were about narrative. And when the narrative started to unravel, the myth got stronger, a dynasty wrapped not in achievements, but in what could have been. The original sin of 20th century America, played out in Ivy League accents and eternal mourning. But every tragedy needs a counterweight, and in Texas, another family was building its own ascent, not with charisma, but calculation, not with myth, but machinery. They weren't raised on romanticism. They were raised on oil, banking, and procedural dominance. Where the Kennedys symbolized what America wanted to be, the next family symbolized what it was becoming. Their name was Bush. 5. Bush dynasties in America aren't supposed to happen by accident. They require orchestration, timing, and a few dozen Ivy League degrees. But the Bush family built theirs the old-fashioned way, quietly, generationally, and with the practiced subtlety of a country club handshake. If the Kennedys were a Roman tragedy performed in perfect lighting, the Bushes were more like a slow-burn procedural, where everyone just keeps getting promoted. It didn't start in Texas. That's the first illusion. It started in New England, with the kind of background that tends to disappear behind the myth of American ruggedness. The Bushes were Connecticut Yankees through and through, old money, discreet power, and more family trees than actual trees on their lawn. And at the center of this social architecture was Prescott Bush. Prescott was a senator from Connecticut, a Wall Street banker, and the kind of man whose suit looked like it came with a trust fund sewn into the lining. He didn't posture or campaign with much flair. He simply arrived. Reliable, tall, appropriately stern. He served as a bridge between the private corridors of capital and the polished chambers of public service. A man who understood that policy and profit, in the right hands, could rhyme. Prescott didn't just believe in institutions. He belonged to them. Yale Skull and Bones, the Union League Club, the Federal Reserve Board of New York. The Bush family wasn't fighting their way into power. They were networking their way through it. Quiet rooms, firm handshakes, Christmas cards sent to exactly the right people. From that genteel furnace emerged his son, George Herbert Walker Bush, war hero, oilman, CIA director, congressman, UN ambassador, vice president, president, one resume away from becoming an institution himself. George H.W. Bush had all the polish of an East Coast aristocrat with just enough Texas swagger to make it palatable to a post-Reagan electorate. He moved to Texas after the war, not out of rebellion, but out of strategic relocation. Oil was there, opportunity was there, and it let him reinvent the Bush name with a cowboy hat and a rotary phone. He didn't need to change who he was, just the lighting. As a politician, George H.W. Bush was the embodiment of institutional competence. He knew the machinery. He respected the process. He made consensus seem like a form of patriotism. As vice president under Reagan, he was the loyal understudy, never flashy, always prepared. And when his turn came in 1988, he stepped up with a campaign that was equal parts hard-nosed and genteel. He won with a smirk and a resume, and then lost 4 years later to a saxophone and a recession. But the Bush dynasty didn't end with a concession speech, because in Texas, once again, another Bush had been preparing, not in war rooms, but in boardrooms. George W. Bush was not his father. That was both his burden and his brand. More cowboy than diplomat, more gut instinct than diplomatic cable, more what me worry than read my lips. And yet, somehow it worked, with a friendly accent and a campaign team that understood narrative better than nuance. George W. became governor of Texas, then mounted a presidential campaign with a slogan so simple it sounded like prophecy: a uniter, not a divider. The 2000 election was a national Rorschach test, a statistical tie, a Florida debacle, and a Supreme Court decision that felt less like closure and more like paperwork. But it worked. George W. Bush became the 43rd president, following in his father's footsteps, albeit in boots. His presidency was dominated by crisis. History handed him a script no one wanted, and he performed it with a mix of earnest conviction and institutional rigidity. He leaned heavily on his advisors, governed from the gut, and turned America's post-Cold War drift into a global mission. He was both the most powerful man in the world and a family scion playing out the final act of a generational plan. And just off stage there was Jeb, the smart one, the competent one, the one groomed for the crown, governor of Florida, fluent in Spanish, wonkish and disciplined. But when his moment came in 2016, America was no longer interested in dynasties that looked like spreadsheets. Jeb walked into a political climate that had been torched and offered policy memos. It didn't go well. The Bush family, once the default setting for Republican respectability, became a relic almost overnight. Their name, once shorthand for continuity, became synonymous with a certain kind of elite insulation. Too careful, too compromised, too polite. But make no mistake, the Bush dynasty changed the shape of American governance. 2 presidents, 2 governors, a senator, CIA leadership, a grip on the Republican Party that lasted nearly 30 years. They played the long game, bet on institutional loyalty, and built their empire not with charisma, but with structure. They were, in many ways, the opposite of the Kennedys. No tragic poetry, no Shakespearean glamour, just legacies passed like briefcases, carefully, quietly, and with a handshake you never noticed. And yet, as the Bushes began to recede from public dominance, another family, older, quieter, and even more judicial, stepped forward. They didn't believe in photo ops, they believed in precedent, in Cincinnati courtrooms, in law clerks and legislative footnotes. They were the Tafts. 6. Taft. If America had a royal house of jurisprudence, an unshakable lineage carved into the marble columns of its courtrooms, it would be the Tafts of Cincinnati. No scandal, no flashbulbs, no gilded mansions, just generations of lawyers, legislators and judges whose influence was measured not in headlines but in footnotes, quietly rearranging the architecture of American governance while everyone else fought over the windows. The Taft family was never interested in the kind of fame that demanded applause. They weren't the kind of dynasty you recognized at a glance. They were the kind you discovered after reading through a 200-page legal opinion and realizing 3 separate Tafts helped write the system it was citing. Their legacy wasn't cinematic, it was constitutional. At the center of this dynasty stood William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States and, uniquely, its 10th Chief Justice, the only man in American history to lead both the executive and judicial branches of government. Not flashy, not electric, but immovable, like the furniture of the Republic. Heavy, serious, and not going anywhere. He was born in 1857 into a well-placed Cincinnati family. His father, Alphonso Taft, had already laid the groundwork, co-founder of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, Secretary of War, Attorney General under President Grant, and U.S. Minister to both Austria-Hungary and Russia. In other words, Alphonso didn't just believe in public service, he considered it a birthright. He didn't chase power, he passed it down like a moral obligation. William followed the script with precision. Yale, law school, judgeships, Solicitor General, Secretary of War, Governor of the Philippines, a perfect resume for a life in robes and case law. But then came the presidency, an opportunity or perhaps a detour offered not by ambition but by Theodore Roosevelt, his close friend and ideological sponsor. Taft didn't want to be president. He wanted to be on the Supreme Court, but Roosevelt insisted, and William, faithful to a fault, complied. He ran, he won, and he governed like the judge he was, interpreting laws instead of bending them. His presidency from 1909 to 1913 was awkward, technocratic, and ultimately doomed by a rift with Roosevelt himself. Taft lacked the showmanship America was increasingly addicted to. Where Roosevelt gave speeches that shook the rafters, Taft read notes off cards. Where Roosevelt charged forward, Taft consulted legal precedent. In the court of public opinion, he was always out-argued, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he didn't realize he was in a trial. In 1912, Roosevelt ran against him as a third-party candidate, splitting the vote and handing the White House to Woodrow Wilson. It was political patricide performed in public. Taft, undramatic as ever, quietly returned to academia, teaching law at Yale and waiting. Not plotting, not grieving, just waiting. And in 1921, the wait paid off. President Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the United States, the position Taft had always wanted. He accepted with the joy of a man finally allowed to be exactly what he was built for. Over the next decade, he reshaped the federal judiciary, streamlined its operations, championed judicial independence, and left behind a court more coherent than he'd found it. He died in 1930. First president to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, first Chief Justice to leave behind a fan base of law students. But the Taft family didn't end there, it simply pivoted. Enter Robert A. Taft, William's son, known in his day as Mr. Republican, a three-term U.S. Senator from Ohio, majority leader and philosophical bedrock of the mid-20th century conservative movement. If his father embodied institutionalism, Robert embodied ideology. He opposed the New Deal, questioned America's role in foreign entanglements, and defended constitutional literalism like it was a family heirloom. He ran for president multiple times, each campaign a long, slow lesson in how ideas can lose to charisma. He was defeated in primaries by Wendell Willkie, then by Eisenhower, the latter of whom had war medals, global recognition, and a smile that could sell canned meat. Robert didn't smile much, but his impact endured. He helped write the Taft-Hartley Act, a cornerstone of U.S. labor law. He shaped the party's soul in the years before it traded caution for television. He represented a kind of patrician conservatism that decades later would be recalled with both nostalgia and suspicion. After all, his conservatism wasn't populist, it was procedural. Less about outrage, more about order. Less about slogans, more about statutes. Other Tafts followed in his footsteps, state senators, federal judges, university presidents. None with presidential reach, but all with resumes that made the Bar Association weep with pride. To this day, Ohio politics carries the residue of the Taft name like a watermark, subtle, persistent, and impossible to scrub out. The family never chased flash. They chased permanence. And in a country that so often measures success in terms of volume, the Tafts succeeded in silence. They didn't shape the American imagination, but they shaped its institutions, its legal scaffolding, its bureaucratic conscience. If the Kennedys were Shakespeare, the Tafts were constitutional law textbooks. And yet, even in their restraint, the Tafts represented something deeply American, the belief that service done correctly should feel inevitable, not performative, not emotional, just correct. But while the Tafts quietly stewarded the Republic from within its marble walls, another family was presiding over an older form of American authority, one that predated the Constitution, outlasted the Civil War, and operated on rules written in family Bibles and plantation deeds. A family for whom lineage wasn't just history, it was strategy. Their name was Lee. 7. Lee, Virginia. Before there were presidents, before there were parties, before the American Revolution even had a uniform, there were the Lees of Virginia. They weren't just early, they were primordial. The Lee family didn't wait for the United States to be born. They were already seated at the table, carving the roast and explaining the rules of inheritance. If the Adams family was America's philosophical conscience, the Lees were its aristocratic shadow, quietly shaping the republic while maintaining the posture of colonial nobility. Their power wasn't loud, it was assumed. The Lees were Virginians in the way glaciers are cold, inherently, profoundly, and immovably. Their lineage stretched back to Richard Lee I, who arrived in the 1640s and did what so many enterprising men did in the early colonial period: amass land, tobacco wealth, and descendants like a regional weather system. He served on the Governor's Council, maintained a profitable transatlantic network, and laid the foundation for a family tree that would sprout into every crevice of American governance. By the time the Revolutionary War loomed, the Lees had become less a family and more a political ecosystem. They were governors, legislators, plantation owners, diplomats. One Lee might be negotiating in France, another could be drafting resolutions against the Stamp Act. There were so many of them that historians have had to clarify which Lee they're talking about by using entire paragraphs. Among the most prominent of these was Richard Henry Lee, the man who formally proposed American independence in the Second Continental Congress in June of 1776. Before Jefferson wrote the lines, Lee made the motion, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. In any other family, that would be the crowning achievement. For the Lees, it was just Tuesday. The Lees operated like an interlocking mechanism, each member placed strategically across Virginia and the colonies, reinforcing one another's influence. They were less a family than a long-term strategy for staying close to the levers of power. They married well, inherited better, and maintained an almost clerical obsession with duty, service, and maintaining their elite status in an emerging democracy that technically didn't want elites. But history, ever patient, had its own ideas, and the name that would define the Lee dynasty was not Richard, or Henry, or Thomas. It was Robert. Robert E. Lee was born in 1807, the son of Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, a Revolutionary War general and former governor of Virginia. The family at that point had suffered some financial decline, nothing catastrophic, just enough to shift them from aristocrats to genteel cautionary tales. Robert, however, carried the family's name like armor. He graduated second in his class at West Point with 0 demerits, an almost unnatural level of discipline. He married Mary Custis, descendant of Martha Washington. If anyone was born to embody the old Virginian ideal, duty, land, honor, it was Robert. He served in the U.S. Army with distinction for decades. He was offered command of the Union Army at the start of the Civil War. He declined. His loyalty, he said, was to Virginia. Not the Confederacy, not the cause, just Virginia. That distinction would become both his legacy and his curse. As commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee became a legend, tactically brilliant, strategically cautious, and almost universally admired even by his enemies. He was the marble statue version of American nobility, elegant, stoic, tragic. But myth has a way of obscuring detail. Lee fought to preserve a society structured around land-holding elites, inherited hierarchy, and rigid social order. His military genius, whatever its merits, was in service to a vision of America that lost. And yet, for more than a century, he was treated not as a defeated general, but as a kind of fallen angel of American virtue. The Lee family name became entangled in the lost cause mythology, memorialized in statues, textbooks, and street names across the South. And through it all, the Lee legacy remained intact, not because of what they accomplished, but because of how deeply they had rooted themselves into the narrative of American identity. Even in defeat, they were respected, revered. Their family homes became museums, their papers archived, their silhouettes bronzed. Today, the Lee name stands at a crossroads of interpretation. Revered by some, re-evaluated by others, their legacy is a masterclass in the elasticity of American memory. They were patriots, rebels, aristocrats, architects of both revolution and rebellion. And through every chapter, they maintained the unmistakable air of a family that believed its authority was never given, only acknowledged. In a way, the Lees embodied the central contradiction of American aristocracy, the idea that in a nation founded on equality, some men were simply born to rule. They didn't have to seize power, they just had to inherit it. But while the Lees were planting their dynasty in Virginia soil up north, another family was quietly drafting the architecture of elite power, not through battles or plantations, but through ships, schools, and something even more enduring than victory, money. Their name was Cabot. 8. Cabot before Wall Street, before Silicon Valley, before America even figured out how to spell capitalism without choking on its ideals, there were the Cabots. Not warriors, not presidents, just rich, old money rich, New England rich, Boston rich, which is to say the kind of wealth so ancient and insular that it stopped being about money sometime around the 1700s and became something closer to climate, permanent, inevitable, inherited. To understand the Cabots, you must first understand Boston, not the Boston of Red Sox hats and Dunkin' Donuts, but the other Boston, the one of Beacon Hill brownstones, Latin inscriptions, and dinner parties where the guest list is the real estate. In that Boston, the Cabots were royalty, not elected, not anointed, just known. The family's legend begins with John Cabot, a French-born immigrant who arrived in Salem, Massachusetts in the early 1700s. He built a shipping empire the old-fashioned way, sugar, rum, fish, and other goods best not inventoried too closely. He and his brothers profited handsomely from transatlantic trade routes that fueled both the colonial economy and the family ledger. By the time the American Revolution arrived, the Cabots weren't rebels, they were stakeholders. From maritime commerce, the family expanded into banking, railroads, and textile manufacturing. They did not innovate, they invested, they didn't disrupt, they stabilized. And in a rapidly changing country, the Cabots figured out something critical. Power doesn't require motion. Sometimes it just needs a permanent address. They built institutions, Harvard, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Boston Athenaeum. They married strategically into the Lodges, the Lowells, and other dynasties so similarly pale and patrician they might as well have been copies of the same family portrait, shuffled and re-signed. Together, they formed what would become known as the Boston Brahmins, a caste of families whose influence operated not through laws or elections, but through etiquette, donations, and dinner invitations. The Cabots didn't just have money, they had taste. They were the stewards of the Republic's conscience, as long as that conscience fit comfortably within Georgian architecture and didn't raise its voice. And yet, for all their restraint, the Cabots were deeply political. George Cabot, a U.S. senator during the Federalist era, was a staunch defender of elite rule in a country that was still pretending to be egalitarian. He opposed the War of 1812 not out of pacifism, but because it was bad for shipping. He viewed democracy with the same polite suspicion he reserved for bad wine. In his world, the people didn't need to govern. They needed to be governed well, preferably by men who read Cicero in Latin and invested in railroads on the side. That ethos, call it patrician paternalism, carried through the generations. Cabots didn't shout, they published essays. They didn't run for office in Beauceau. Mobs they were appointed. They didn't protest. They endowed chairs. The family motto may as well have been influence, never impulse. There's a famous and almost certainly apocryphal line about Boston's elite that goes, in Boston, the Lowells speak only to Cabots and the Cabots speak only to God. It's meant to be a joke, sort of. But like most dynastic power, the punchline is just a veil for the truth. By the late 19th century, the Cabots were everywhere that mattered, and nowhere that screamed. They served as trustees, presidents, curators. They sat on the boards of everything from museums to universities to private banks, so private you needed a genealogy chart just to find the front door. They weren't America's public face, they were its invisible hand. While the South waged war over slavery and the West erupted in gold fever, the Cabots were quietly codifying the rules of American aristocracy. Keep your money quiet, keep your scandals quieter, and above all, marry correctly. If they had a religion, it was Harvard. If they had a language, it was understatement. If they had a foreign policy, it was isolationist, except when trade was involved. And if they had a flaw, it was that they mistook their own stability for virtue. The 20th century didn't unseat the Cabots so much as diffuse them. Their name shows up less frequently now, but their influence lingers in the boards of non-profits, the bylaws of private clubs, and the genealogical charts of people who've never had to fill out a FAFSA. The Cabots were never loud enough to be icons, never common enough to be relatable. They didn't build the dream, they built the walls around it. But if the Cabots were the whisper of American elite power, their in-laws were its megaphone. Because right across the drawing room, at the same Harvard dining tables, another family was rising. A family of poets, presidents, reformers, and inevitably tragedy. The Lowells. 9. Lowell. If the Cabots were the stone columns of Boston society, stoic, silent, and unmoved, then the Lowells were its stained glass, intellectual, self-regarding, colourful, in a restrained sort of way. They didn't just belong to the American aristocracy, they narrated it, in verse, in policy, in tenured lectures from behind polished mahogany desks. Where the Cabots built ships and banks, the Lowells built ideas. But don't be fooled, this was not the romantic ideal of poets starving in attic apartments. The Lowells were not bohemians. They were Brahmins with sonnets. They saw no contradiction between owning textile mills and editing literary journals. In fact, they considered it a kind of civic responsibility to own the country's soul and still correct its grammar. The Lowell family line begins, appropriately enough, in industry. John Lowell, the 18th century patriarch, was a lawyer and Federalist who helped write the Massachusetts Constitution and served as a judge under George Washington. His descendants would include politicians, lawyers, educators, and crucially, textile magnates who transformed the Merrimack Valley into a cathedral of capitalist ambition. The city of Lowell, Massachusetts was named after them, and for good reason. It was one of America's first planned industrial cities, a place where mechanical looms replaced cottage labor, and where the American dream of economic expansion became mechanized. The Lowells turned cotton into capital, and capital into culture. In the North, they were seen as progressive industrialists. In the South, perhaps less charitably, as well-dressed abolitionists with a habit of monetizing morality. But the Lowell identity was never purely economic. The family moved fluently between money and meaning, often landing on both. They sat on the boards of Harvard and NYT, directed museums, and published books that appeared on both syllabi and side tables. They didn't see wealth and wisdom as opposing forces. They saw them as mutually reinforcing. After all, who better to understand the future of democracy than the people who already owned its factories? One of the most influential was James Russell Lowell, a 19th century poet, essayist, diplomat, and Harvard professor. He was the kind of man who could compose a stirring abolitionist poem in the morning, deliver a lecture on Dante at noon, and serve as U.S. Minister to Spain before dinner. He helped edit the Atlantic Monthly and the North American Review, magazines that functioned as intellectual salons in print. His politics were occasionally inconsistent, idealistic but cautious, but his prose could make even his critics sigh with envy. Then came Abbott Lawrence Lowell, the family's most influential institutional figure and president of Harvard University from 1909 to 1933. Under his leadership, Harvard expanded its physical campus, strengthened its academic standards, and doubled down on its status as the central cathedral of the American elite. Abbott was an innovator, yes, but also a gatekeeper. He introduced reforms that shaped the modern university system, including the house system and academic departments. But his tenure wasn't without shadows. He opposed co-education. He enforced strict admissions quotas that effectively capped the number of Jewish students, policies that historians now view as polite-sounding mechanisms for discrimination. Like many in his class, Lowell believed in merit, so long as it arrived with the right last name and the right accent. The Lowell name continued to resonate into the 20th century, but perhaps no descendant would become as hauntingly symbolic as Robert Lowell, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, whose work chronicled not just American decline, but personal unraveling. He wrote about war, madness, religion, and history with a voice that felt both ancient and frayed. He came from greatness and spent most of his life trying to either justify it or exorcise it. In Robert, the Lowell legacy became paradoxical, a poet of privilege chronicling his own implosion with surgical beauty. He once described his ancestors as Puritans who turned into Episcopalians and then into agnostics and finally into manic depressives. That sentence reads like a confession or a prophecy. By the late 20th century, the Lowells had receded from the public spotlight, not in disgrace, but in quiet exhaustion. Their institutions lived on: Harvard, MIT, the museums and libraries they helped build. Their names are etched on plaques, spoken in faculty meetings, and buried in the acknowledgments of books they inspired. But the family itself, its voice, its visibility, began to fade into the very intellectual architecture it created. They weren't outshouted, they were outlasted. And yet, every so often, their presence flickers. In a line of poetry, in a lecture hall, in the eerie sense that somewhere, someone with a narrow face and a broader worldview is still writing position papers on the moral architecture of federalism. But if the Lowells were the voice of Boston's conscience, articulate, composed, increasingly unsure of itself, their in-laws were the ones holding the gavel. Because in the gilded drawing rooms and Senate chambers of old Massachusetts, another family had learned how to translate wealth into law and law into power. They were the Lodges. 10 Lodge. In the high councils of American aristocracy, there's a difference between influence and authority. The Cabots invested in systems, the Lowells wrote them down. But the Lodges ran them, not loudly, not wildly, but with the dry precision of men who were born with gavels in their bassinets and Senate seats penciled into their baby books. The Lodge family was what you got when you combined legal pedigree, social rigidity, and an unshakable belief that the Republic would be safest if only their cousins were allowed to run it. They weren't revolutionaries or robber barons. They were managers of the nation, of its decorum, and more than anything, of its memory. They made no effort to disguise their origins. This was old money with old manners. The Lodges were steeped in Boston Brahmin sensibility, Harvard-educated, white-gloved, Episcopalian, and allergic to improvisation. If they'd had a coat of arms, it would have featured a Latin phrase about responsibility, flanked by a golf club and a Federalist essay. At the heart of their dynasty stood Henry Cabot Lodge, the Elder. Born in 1850, he was the product of every elite institution that Massachusetts had to offer: Harvard College, Harvard Law, Harvard PhD in political science, which at the time was barely even a field, but he insisted on making it one. His career trajectory was so predictable, it bordered on performance art. Academic, historian, state legislator, congressman, senator. But Lodge didn't just write about American government, he enforced it. He served in the U.S. Senate from 1893 until his death in 1924, where he emerged as one of the most influential figures in the legislative branch, not because of charisma, but because of institutional command. He understood procedure the way generals understand terrain. Lodge was a conservative nationalist who believed in American strength abroad and elite rule at home. He supported the Spanish-American War, backed naval expansion, and viewed the United States as a reluctant but destined imperial power. His worldview was not about conquest. It was about stewardship, particularly by those already seated at the best tables. But his most defining moment came after World War I, when he led the Senate's opposition to the Treaty of Versailles and, more crucially, the League of Nations. President Woodrow Wilson had negotiated the treaty and saw the League as the dawn of a new world order. Lodge saw it as a bureaucratic trap, a supranational leash that would dilute American sovereignty and, worse, force the US to consult foreigners. The fight between Wilson and Lodge was deeply personal and utterly poisonous. Both men were prideful, academic, and convinced they were the sole custodians of American destiny. The result? The Senate refused to ratify the treaty. The League of Nations proceeded without the US, and the American tradition of selectively international engagement was born. In Lodge, America saw the archetype of the elite conservative, articulate, stubborn, and deeply suspicious of change that didn't originate from a committee he chaired. His opposition wasn't based on populism. It was based on protocol. He didn't fear democracy, he just preferred it when filtered through Harvard. But the Lodge name didn't end with Henry. It came back a generation later, this time with a middle initial. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., grandson of the original, was born into expectation and carried it like a monogram. Educated at Groton and Harvard, fluent in foreign affairs and political etiquette by age 20, Lodge Jr. followed his grandfather's path into the Senate and then into the world stage. But he carried something his grandfather never needed: adaptability. Lodge Jr. served in World War II while still holding his Senate seat. He lost that seat in 1952 to a rising congressman named John F. Kennedy, only to bounce back as a diplomat and power broker. He served as ambassador to the United Nations, to West Germany, and to South Vietnam, essentially wherever Cold War tensions were running hottest. In 1960, he was selected as Richard Nixon's running mate, and together they lost to the very same Kennedy family that had once dethroned him in Massachusetts. It was a poetic reversal, two dynasties swapping places in the public imagination. The old line Republican patrician upstaged by the new line Democratic glamour. But Lodge didn't disappear. He returned to diplomacy, kept serving under multiple administrations, and maintained that most Brahmin of American beliefs, that governing wasn't about winning, it was about stewardship, about keeping the ship upright, even when flashier captains tried to sail it into history books. By the 1970s, the Lodge family influence had faded from public view, replaced by louder, leaner, more populist voices. But they left behind institutions, habits, and a moral framework that still echoes through Senate traditions and diplomatic protocol. Even now, you can hear a trace of Lodge restraint in certain carefully worded memos, or see it in the unspoken rules of Washington etiquette. They never owned the spotlight, they curated the script. But dynasties have a funny way of trading in old capital for new currency. And as the Lodges made their final bows in the halls of policy and protocol, another family, distant, industrial, and armed with something more combustible than etiquette, was rising from the smokestacks of Delaware. Their name was DuPont. 11. DuPont. If American aristocracy had a chemistry lab, it would look a lot like the DuPont family compound. Sprawling estates, fortified gates, and a patriarch who once figured out how to turn explosives into generational power. While the Cabots had shipping, the Lowells had poetry, and the Lodges had diplomacy, the DuPonts had gunpowder. Literal black powder gunpowder, and from that controlled combustion came one of the longest, richest, and most quietly omnipresent dynasties in American history. The story begins in 1800 when Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, a French-born chemist trained under the legendary Antoine Lavoisier, fled the chaos of post-revolutionary France and settled along the Brandywine River in Delaware. He saw a business opportunity in what others considered niche, manufacturing gunpowder for the American market. By 1802, the DuPont powder mill was operational, and by 1812, thanks to a convenient war with Britain, it was profitable. Very profitable. This wasn't artisanal backwoods powder making, this was precision engineering backed by Enlightenment science. And Eleuthère wasn't some war profiteer in a waistcoat, he was a nation builder with an eye for stability. Over the next century, the DuPont Company would supply explosives for every major American conflict, build a monopoly that cornered over 70% of the global powder market, and transform the family into something more than rich. It made them infrastructural, but it wasn't just about the products, it was about the structure. The DuPonts institutionalized family control long before it became standard practice in American capitalism. They created trusts, boards, and carefully orchestrated successions. Cousins married cousins, strategically. Board seats were inherited like surnames. Family governance was treated with the seriousness of statecraft. At times, the DuPonts were less a family and more a corporate organism with a shared surname and a shared goal: permanence. By the 20th century, the family's influence had spread far beyond explosives. They'd diversified, first into chemicals, then into synthetics, and eventually into everything. DuPont, the company, became synonymous with American industrial optimism. It invented nylon, Teflon, Kevlar, Tyvek, neoprene, substances that don't just exist in the modern world, but define it. Need a spacesuit? Kevlar. A waterproof tarp? Tyvek. A non-stick pan to cook your eggs while contemplating the cost of corporate innovation? Teflon. This wasn't just capitalism, it was alchemy. The DuPonts didn't just sell products, they sold permanence. Politically, the family kept itself woven tightly into the machinery of Delaware, a state they practically owned by proximity, but their influence extended well beyond its borders. Through campaign donations, think tanks, and policy institutes, the DuPonts ensured that their interests and their ideology stayed upstream of legislation. They were small government, industrialists, free market philosophers, and believers in corporate stewardship. Power, yes, but always with an embroidered seat cushion. One of the most visible political heirs of the dynasty was Pierre S. DuPont IV, governor of Delaware and one-time presidential candidate in the 1988 Republican primaries. He ran on a platform of supply-side economics and limited federal oversight, policies that, it must be said, would have sounded suspiciously convenient at family reunions. But even as public-facing influence waned, the structure remained. By the 1960s, there were over 3,000 DuPont descendants, many of them shareholders, most of them insulated by layers of family trusts, private schools, and stately homes with more fireplaces than people. The family was decentralized, but not fragmented, united by wealth management, corporate boards, and the kind of shared legacy that can't be liquidated. Then came the slow unraveling. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, DuPont, the company, faced antitrust challenges, lawsuits over environmental damage, and the existential identity crisis of all sprawling industrial giants: innovation or ossification. The firm merged, unmerged, and restructured with increasing urgency. It spun off divisions, sold legacy products, and entered into controversial partnerships. The family, once synonymous with control, found itself navigating a corporate world where control was increasingly theoretical. But the DuPonts had always been realists. They knew dynasties didn't survive by resisting change. They survived by designing it. The estates in Delaware are still there. Winterthur, Nemours, Eleutherian mills, monuments to a dynasty that never needed to scream to be heard. Their names linger on museums, hospitals, environmental studies, and high-speed materials you didn't realize had brand names. Their philanthropy, like their legacy, is understated, deliberate, and engineered for longevity. And yet, despite the influence, the power, and the wealth that once underwrote the American empire from beneath the chemical hood, the DuPonts remain eerily absent from the cultural imagination. No presidential library, no Time magazine covers, no nostalgia tour. Because the DuPonts weren't built for visibility, they were built for resilience. But while they shaped the 20th century with molecules and mergers, another family, far brasher, far newer, was preparing to reshape it with oil ambition and a last name designed for executive summary. Their fortune was so vast it needed a map. Their name was Rockefeller. 12. Rockefeller. There are American dynasties that influence the country, and then there's the Rockefeller family, who built the country, bought a sizable chunk of it, named a few landmarks after themselves, and then quietly set the terms for polite philanthropy for the next 100 years. When the Rockefellers arrived on the scene in the late 19th century, they didn't just play the game of American capitalism, they rewrote it, patented it, and put it in a trust. The dynasty begins, as many dynasties do, with a paradox. John D. Rockefeller, son of a conman and a Sunday school teacher. Born in 1839, raised in upstate New York and later in Ohio, he learned early that you could build a life out of contradictions as long as you controlled the narrative. His father was a traveling doctor of dubious morality. His mother, devout and composed, taught thrift, piety, and control. John D. adopted exactly half of that formula and used it to become the richest man in modern history. By the time he was 30, John D. was in the oil business. By 40, he had founded Standard Oil, a corporation so powerful, so vertically integrated, and so disturbingly efficient that it didn't just dominate its competitors, it absorbed them. If your refinery wasn't Standard Oil, it was eventually purchased, undercut, or reorganized into something indistinguishable. What Microsoft was to the digital age, Standard Oil was to the industrial one, except with more barrels and fewer congressional hearings until later. At its peak, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of U.S. oil refining. And yet, John D. himself kept a famously low public profile. No yachts, no cigars, no palace-style ostentation. Just long hours, ledgers, and Baptist restraint. He gave dimes to children and tracked donations like battlefield maneuvers. He saw wealth not as indulgence, but as a divine test. To own that much was to be accountable for it. But even in secrecy, empires cast shadows. The U.S. government finally intervened, breaking up Standard Oil in 1911 into 34 smaller companies, several of which, like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, would later become Goliaths themselves. The trust was broken. The fortune was not. Rockefeller emerged from the breakup even richer because he owned shares in all the new entities. The antitrust case didn't end his reign. It diversified it. By the time of his death in 1937, John D. Rockefeller had donated over $500 million, an astronomical figure at the time, to everything from universities to medical research to global public health initiatives. His donations created the University of Chicago, funded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, and helped eradicate diseases in multiple countries. He may not have built cathedrals, but he built institutions that outlasted most of them. But dynasties aren't built on single men. They require heirs, and the Rockefellers had plenty. John D. had 5 children, but it was his son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who fully industrialized the family legacy. Jr. was quiet, methodical, and almost allergic to flamboyance. He oversaw the family's business interests, helped fund the reconstruction of colonial Williamsburg, and spearheaded massive philanthropic efforts in education, public housing, and international relations. He also commissioned the Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, an Art Deco temple to capital and culture built during the Great Depression. That a Rockefeller could build such a monument in the midst of economic collapse was not lost on anyone. The building was more than a skyscraper. It was an announcement. The Rockefellers were not going anywhere. From there, the family's influence widened like a net. The third generation, often called the cousins, entered politics, conservation, finance, and diplomacy. Most prominent among them was Nelson Rockefeller, the four-time governor of New York, vice president under Gerald Ford, and perpetual almost president. Nelson embodied the family's uneasy relationship with electoral power. Immensely capable, impossibly wealthy, and permanently misaligned with the populist mood. His politics were pragmatic and centrist. His campaigns were less about victory than about presence. Nelson didn't need the presidency. He was a state. Then there was David Rockefeller, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and the family's unofficial ambassador to global finance. He hosted kings, dined with dictators, and helped define the modern corporation as an international political actor. His influence wasn't theoretical, it was logistical. If a deal happened in the 20th century that involved money, land, and diplomacy, David either facilitated it or received a memo about it. The Rockefeller family was everywhere, funding the arts, underwriting the United Nations, reshaping medicine, and sponsoring environmental conservation while still earning dividends from the fossil fuel industry that had made it all possible. They were philanthropists, yes, but also brand managers for American respectability. Their name became shorthand for elegant power, well-lit, well-dressed, and never questioned at dinner. And yet, by the late 20th century, their aura began to flicker. The world had changed. Billionaires no longer hid their wealth behind foundations. They launched tech startups and Twitter accounts. The Rockefellers had museums. The new rich had algorithms. The dynasty didn't disappear, it just aged out of the spotlight, replaced by noisier models of influence. But their impact remains fossilized into American architecture. Their name is etched into the skyline, woven into the syllabus, and embedded in the DNA of every non-profit that uses words like sustainability and capacity building. They never wanted to rule the republic. They wanted to shape it quietly, methodically, permanently. But as the Rockefellers were refining the high art of elite benevolence, another family, one born from steel, trains, and ruthless lending, was perfecting a different model of control. They didn't ask for influence. They took it. Their name was Morgan. 13. Morgan. There are families that rise to power by legacy, others by marriage, and still others by sheer proximity to the machinery of government. The Morgans, however, carved their dynasty out of something far less sentimental: credit. Cold, institutional, leveraged credit. If the Rockefellers were the oil that powered the American engine, the Morgans were the bankers who owned the vehicle, financed the road, and quietly decided whether anyone else could drive. To understand the Morgan dynasty, you must first understand its founder, not a president, not a general, but a man whose very name still hangs over global finance like a Gothic chandelier: John Pierpont Morgan. Born in 1837 to a New England banking family already rooted in international finance, J.P. Morgan didn't so much build his empire as much as he scaled it. He was educated in Boston, then Germany, spoke multiple languages, and could smell a failing investment before it hit the ledger. He wasn't a populist or a philosopher or even particularly interested in politics. What he was, above all else, was a stabilizer. Morgan didn't believe in the free market. He believed in order. And when capitalism threatened to spin off its axis, Morgan appointed himself the adult in the room. He made his fortune in railroads, buying, consolidating, and streamlining an industry so chaotic it made spaghetti look well organized. He then applied the same methods to steel, merging Andrew Carnegie's vast holdings into U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. It was not a merger, it was an event, one that cemented Morgan's place not just in finance but in myth. By the early 1900s, Morgan wielded more economic power than the U.S. Treasury. When financial panics hit, as they frequently did in those years, it wasn't the government that people turned to, it was him. In 1907, amid a banking crisis, Morgan personally gathered the heads of major financial institutions in his library, locked the doors, and brokered a bailout to prevent the collapse of the American economy. No congressional hearings, no Treasury intervention, just one man in a pinstripe suit telling other men to sign on the dotted line. This, of course, horrified the country. That a single financier could wield such unchecked power became the justification for the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, designed in part to ensure that no one like J.P. Morgan could ever act as a one-man central bank again. In a sense, the Federal Reserve was not born out of economic theory. It was born out of Morgan fatigue. But even as his public image darkened, his private network expanded. Morgan believed in institutions, museums, libraries, symphonies, and he funded them liberally, but without fanfare. He was not trying to charm the public, he was trying to civilize it. Morgan died in 1913, but the dynasty didn't end. It evolved. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., inherited not just the family bank, but the family posture. Restrained, patrician, indispensable. Known as Jack, he led J.P. Morgan and Company through World War I, underwriting loans to the Allies and effectively turning Wall Street into the war's financier. After the war, Morgan Jr. remained a central figure in transatlantic finance, brokering debts, managing reparations, and quietly keeping European economies solvent. At home, however, public sentiment was shifting. The populist wave of the 1930s turned Wall Street into a four-letter word and the Morgans into an easy target. Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration launched investigations, imposed regulations, and made a public show of humbling the once invincible banking elite. But the Morgans didn't rage. They adjusted. Slowly, discreetly, the family firm divested from commercial banking, restructured itself into an investment powerhouse, and continued to move billions, just without the publicity. Through the mid-20th century, the Morgan name remained synonymous with institutional finance. They didn't run for office. They didn't pose for Time magazine. They built the scaffolding of capitalism and hired others to walk the high beams. As Wall Street mutated in the 1980s and 1990s into something louder, faster, and more algorithmic, the original J.P. Morgan and Company merged with Chase Manhattan Bank, forming what would become J.P. Morgan Chase, a multinational titan that still bears the Morgan name, long after the bloodline faded from its boardrooms. The family itself, by the 21st century, had largely withdrawn from public life. Unlike the Rockefellers or the Kennedys, there was no visible Morgan heir giving speeches or running for governor. The dynasty didn't need faces. It had infrastructure. Its true heirs weren't surnamed Morgan. They were named Moody's, Goldman, BlackRock. The Morgan legacy wasn't a person. It was a system. And yet, even in their institutional twilight, the Morgans left behind more than wealth. They left a vision of order over chaos, of capital over spectacle, of influence that whispered from behind the curtain. No scandals, no dynastic implosions, just a family that helped write the rules and then quietly stepped back while the rest of the world played by them. But as the Morgans perfected the art of invisible empire, another family was doing the opposite. Flashy, defiant, and unapologetically ostentatious, they took their railroad fortune and built mansions. The size of their wealth was measured not in ledgers, but in ceiling frescoes. They didn't want to run the world. They wanted to be seen owning it. Their name was Vanderbilt. 14. Vanderbilt. If the Morgans were the architects of American finance, the Vanderbilts were its marble facade, towering, dazzling, and just a little too ornate to be sustainable. Where the Rockefellers preferred quiet control and the DuPonts engineered their wealth behind closed doors, the Vanderbilts threw the front doors open and held a gala on the front lawn. They were not subtle, they were not discreet. They didn't just live the American dream, they flaunted it, built palaces around it, and dared you to say it was too much. At the heart of this empire was Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who started life with neither marble nor manners. Born in 1794 on Staten Island to a modest Dutch farming family, he quit school at age 11 and started ferrying goods across New York Harbor with a single boat. By the time he was 16, he was running his own transport business. By 40, he had a fleet, and by 70, he had consolidated enough power to make himself a force of nature. He began with steamboats, disrupting passenger and freight routes along the eastern seaboard with a combination of brutal pricing and backdoor deals. He wasn't inventing anything, just outworking and outmaneuvering everyone who did. Eventually, when water routes no longer satisfied his appetite for scale, he turned his attention to the future: railroads. In the mid-19th century, the American railroad was a chaotic, clunky, unregulated mess. Dozens of lines, all competing, all inefficient. Vanderbilt saw opportunity in the mess. He bought, merged, and bullied his way into dominance. Lines like the New York Central became the backbone of a transportation empire that stretched from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. He didn't just move people, he moved the country. By the time he died in 1877, Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt had amassed one of the greatest fortunes in human history. Estimates vary, but when adjusted for inflation, it easily surpassed $200 billion in modern terms. It was staggering, it was grotesque, and it was only the beginning. Unlike some self-made tycoons, Vanderbilt did not romanticize thrift or modesty. His will allocated the vast majority of his fortune to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who doubled it within a decade. William was less aggressive, but far more effective. He didn't have his father's blunt charisma, but he understood numbers, consolidation, and the value of keeping the system in the family. "The public be damned," he famously said, when asked if his railroad served the public interest, a quote that functioned as both a mission statement and a conversation ender. But then, as with so many dynasties, came the third generation. The grandchildren of Cornelius inherited not just wealth, but its gravitational distortions. They didn't build businesses, they built monuments. They erected mansions in Manhattan, Newport, and Asheville that made European aristocrats blush. The Breakers, the Biltmore Estate, the Marble House, structures that looked less like homes and more like architectural shrines to opulence. One Vanderbilt grandson, George Washington Vanderbilt II, built the Biltmore in North Carolina, America's largest private home, complete with a 250-room French Renaissance chateau, 8,000 acres of landscaped grounds, and a library that would make the Vatican seem poorly read. This was the Gilded Age in its purest form, wealth not as capital, but as theatre. Parties, yachts, custom ceilings, Italian gardens, symbols designed to stun and suppress. The Vanderbilts weren't just rich, they were rich enough to make it awkward, but behind the splendor was a quiet erosion. The family's immense fortune, spread across dozens of heirs, began to dilute. Some invested wisely, many did not. There were artists, dilettantes, minor sportsmen, and society fixtures. There was Gloria Vanderbilt, the 20th century fashion icon and heiress who turned her name into a brand, and then watched her family's remaining fortune wither in courtrooms and custody battles. Her son, Anderson Cooper, famously remarked that there was no trust fund waiting for him. By the 1970s, the Vanderbilt family, once the wealthiest in America, was selling off its mansions and memorabilia to pay estate taxes. It wasn't scandal, it was math. The Vanderbilt story, perhaps more than any other American dynasty, functions as a parable of scale without strategy, of spectacle without continuity, of wealth so vast it was treated like air, everywhere, taken for granted and slowly leaking. But even in their decline, the Vanderbilts left a mark. Their name is still carved into streets, universities, and train terminals. Vanderbilt University, Grand Central Terminal, and half a dozen luxury real estate developments bear the brand of a family that once defined excess. And they redefined what American royalty could look like. Not noble bloodlines or intellectual rigor, but cash, liquid, unapologetic, and on full display. Yet while the Vanderbilts were building pleasure palaces and dining under imported ceilings, another family was amassing a different kind of real estate. Not mansions, but Manhattan. Not furniture, but fur. They weren't barons of industry, they were cartographers of land ownership. They were the Astors. 15. Astor. If the Vanderbilts turned money into marble, the Astors turned it into land, block after block, uptown and down. While other families invested in ships, oil, or politics, the Astors invested in something less dramatic but far more durable: Manhattan. Not its skyline, its ground, dirt, real estate, the kind of quiet empire that didn't sparkle but could not be moved. It all began with John Jacob Astor, a man who looked at the young American Republic and didn't see a country. He saw a marketplace. Born in Germany in 1763, he immigrated to the United States after the Revolutionary War with a few musical instruments and no money. But unlike most self-made men, Astor wasn't fueled by dream or ideology. He was driven by inventory. He sold flutes, then furs, then the idea of control itself. By the early 1800s, Astor had carved out a near monopoly on the North American fur trade through his American Fur Company. He wasn't the only fur merchant, but he was the one with the best contracts, the lowest prices, and the least sentimentality. He played British, Canadian, and Native American suppliers against each other and built outposts as far west as Oregon, effectively making him one of the first businessmen to think of the United States as a continental economy. But it wasn't the fur trade that secured the Astor legacy. That business, like all resource empires, had a natural expiration date. What made Astor eternal was his second act: real estate, specifically New York real estate. With the profits from fur, he began buying land, mostly in northern Manhattan, which at the time was sparsely populated and relatively cheap. He had no intention of selling. He didn't flip properties, he held. As New York grew upward and outward, the value of his holdings exploded. By the time of his death in 1848, John Jacob Astor was the richest man in America, with an estate estimated at over $20 million, well over $700 million today, if you don't factor in the absurdity of trying to adjust for historical dominance. But unlike other dynasties, where wealth gets subdivided and diluted through endless branches, the Astors practiced a kind of hereditary minimalism. One heir, one line. Keep the fortune centralized, control the narrative. His son, William Backhouse Astor, expanded the family's holdings with the same caution and precision. No yachts, no scandals, just leases, contracts, and deeds. By the mid-19th century, the Astors owned so much of Manhattan that their wealth seemed less like a fortune and more like a geological feature. By the late 1800s, however, a different kind of Astor began to emerge. John Jacob Astor IV, the great-grandson of the founder, rebranded the family image, not by abandoning real estate, but by gilding it. He built the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a monument to opulence and technological modernity. It had electricity, private bathrooms, and telephones in every room. Outrageous luxuries at the time. The Waldorf wasn't just a hotel. It was a new model for how the rich should be housed when temporarily away from their mansions. But even as the buildings got taller, the fortune remained strangely inert. The Astors didn't diversify into manufacturing or railroads. They didn't chase trends. They were, in the purest sense, landlords. Their power was invisible but unavoidable. Every rent check, every lease renewal, every square foot of Manhattan that changed hands passed, somewhere, through an Astor ledger. Yet the 20th century brought complications. New York's real estate market changed. Family divisions deepened. Legal fights emerged over wills, shares, and trust allocations. The family had grown too large, too fractured. Some Astors became British nobility. Others became American socialites. A few tried philanthropy. A few tried reinvention. And slowly, the unified Astor grip on New York loosened. The land was still valuable, but the name had lost its singular weight. By the time the late 20th century rolled around, the Astor legacy had migrated into foundation work, public libraries, and plaques, quiet acknowledgements of a family that once owned the island they now merely sponsored. Still, the residue of their reign remains. Astor Place, Astoria, Astor Row, and of course the enduring image of the American landlord dynasty who didn't need to invent anything, just to own it first. But while the Astors held land, another family held something even more powerful: policy. Their influence ran not through buildings or battleships, but through the very structure of government finance. A name less opulent, less visible, and far more embedded. The Mellons. 16. Mellon. The Mellons didn't need to build skyscrapers, invade newspapers, or slap their name across entire city blocks to become one of America's most enduring dynasties. They simply mastered the levers behind the curtain. While the Vanderbilts dazzled and the Astors collected rent, the Mellons sat quietly in Pittsburgh, investing in everything the other dynasties would eventually rely on: steel, oil, coal, aluminum, banking, and, at one point, the entire US Treasury. They weren't loud. They were foundational, and their story is what happens when a dynasty doesn't just accumulate wealth, it starts to resemble a branch of government. It all began with Thomas Mellon, a Scotch-Irish immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1818 as a 10-year-old boy with little more than a Protestant work ethic and an affinity for ledger books. He studied law, became a judge, and in 1869 founded T. Mellon and Sons, a modest banking firm in Pittsburgh. That firm would grow into the Mellon Bank, and that bank would quietly embed itself in the machinery of American capitalism. But Thomas was just the prologue. The real architects of the dynasty were his sons, Andrew W. Mellon and Richard B. Mellon, who took the family business and turned it into a launchpad for industrial dominance. Pittsburgh was a furnace of invention at the turn of the 20th century, and the Mellons were its bankers. They didn't invent steel, aluminum, or oil refining, but they financed the people who did. They backed Charles M. Schwab's steel ventures. They financed Henry Clay Frick's Koch empire. They funded Gulf Oil before it was a global brand. But their most significant and enduring investment came in 1883, when they took a chance on a struggling aluminum company run by an ambitious chemist named Charles Martin Hall. That company would become Alcoa. At the time, aluminum was more expensive than gold. Within a few decades, it was being stamped, cast, and welded into everything from aircraft to soda cans, and the Mellons, who held controlling interest, effectively controlled the light metal revolution. But Andrew Mellon wasn't content with just managing an empire. He wanted to shape the country. In 1921, he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury under President Harding, then under President Coolidge, then under President Hoover. 3 administrations, 11 years. It was the kind of tenure unheard of in modern politics, and for good reason. Andrew Mellon's influence over US economic policy was not just significant, it was seismic. He pushed for tax cuts across the board, believing that reducing top marginal rates would increase investment, productivity, and ultimately federal revenue. This was not a fringe theory. It was Mellonomics, and it became the blueprint for what we now recognize as supply-side economics. He slashed taxes, reduced public debt, and kept interest rates low. To his supporters, he was a fiscal genius. To his critics, he was the high priest of trickle-down orthodoxy, giving to the rich under the pretense of helping the nation. But either way, the Treasury under Mellon was less a public office and more a private philosophy dressed in constitutional authority. The Wall Street crash of 1929 changed all of that. As the Great Depression took hold, Mellon's policies and his fortune came under intense scrutiny. He was accused of favoring banks over workers, capital over labor, and of being dangerously detached from the realities of mass unemployment. FDR campaigned in 1932 with Mellon's name practically tattooed on his speeches, calling for the removal of economic royalists from the government. Mellon eventually resigned, but not in disgrace. He simply faded back into the shadows from which he'd emerged, and even as he exited the national stage, his fingerprints remained on everything from tax policy to banking regulation. But the Mellons were never just one man. The next generation pivoted from policy to philanthropy, not as a rebrand, but as a continuation. Andrew Mellon donated his personal art collection and $10 million to establish the National Gallery of Art, creating a cultural institution as monumental as his economic legacy. The family poured money into universities, hospitals, research labs, and conservation efforts. Carnegie Mellon University, while named in part for Andrew Carnegie, was significantly shaped and funded by the Mellon family for decades. They also established the Mellon Foundation, now one of the largest and most respected philanthropic organizations in the world, quietly funding the arts, humanities, and education with the same deliberate pace that once characterized their banking operations. Even today, the Mellon name is a kind of cultural watermark, quiet, respectable, embedded in the fine print of a museum brochure or the funding disclosure of a public radio segment. You don't see them at galas or in campaign ads. That's the point. Their power was never performative. It was procedural. If the Vanderbilts showed you their wealth and the Rockefellers curated it, the Mellons institutionalized it. Their legacy isn't a castle or a campaign. It's a system. One that still funds, still guides, and still remembers that true dynasties don't need to be seen to be in control. But as the Mellons bankrolled the framework of respectable capital, another family was printing headlines with their name in every column inch. Not financiers, not presidents, but kingmakers of a very different kind. They owned the ink. They owned the paper. They owned the scandal. They were the Hearsts. 17. Hearst. If the Mellons built America's institutions, the Hearsts built its illusions, brick by brick, headline by headline. They didn't just shape public opinion, they manufactured it, sold it, and ran it above the fold. The Hearst dynasty wasn't about power behind the scenes, it was about power in bold font, loud, theatrical, ink-stained, and entirely unapologetic. Where the Morgans controlled finance and the Rockefellers controlled oil, the Hearsts controlled the narrative. And they knew that in a democracy, perception was more than half the game. At the center of this media empire stood William Randolph Hearst, a man whose biography reads like satire written by a printing press. Born in 1863 to George Hearst, a mining tycoon and U.S. Senator from California, William inherited not just a vast fortune, but a deep understanding of two things. One, how to extract wealth from the earth, and two, how to extract loyalty from the masses. He chose the latter. After being expelled from Harvard for what university historians might call flamboyant insubordination, Hearst convinced his father to let him take over the struggling San Francisco Examiner. What he did with it would become the blueprint for 20th century media. Sensationalism, scandal, oversized headlines, human interest stories that practically shouted from the page. It wasn't about facts, it was about feelings. Readers didn't need to be informed, they needed to be activated. By the 1890s, Hearst had taken this model national, acquiring the New York Journal and diving headfirst into the most explosive rivalry in media history, Hearst versus Pulitzer. The two publishers fought a public battle for circulation supremacy, inventing what we now call yellow journalism, a sensational, emotionally charged form of storytelling that favored drama over detail and narrative over nuance. In modern terms, they were the original clickbait architects. But unlike today's algorithms, Hearst knew his audience personally. He understood the American public's appetite for heroism, fear, and outrage, and he gave it to them in serialized form, printed daily with morning coffee. The culmination of this editorial warfare came in 1898 during the run-up to the Spanish-American War. Hearst's papers printed stories of Spanish atrocities in Cuba, many of them exaggerated, some entirely fabricated. When artist Frederick Remington wrote from Havana to report that things were quiet and there was no war to cover, Hearst allegedly replied, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." Historians still debate the authenticity of the quote, but the spirit was undeniable. Hearst didn't observe events, he engineered them. He wasn't just a publisher, he was a political force in a three-piece suit. He ran for office himself, first as a Democrat, then flirting with populist movements, always hovering just outside the mainstream. He was elected to Congress in 1902, but never quite cracked the national stage. His ambitions were real, but his reputation had already outgrown him. He wasn't trusted by elites, and he wasn't easy to package as a serious candidate. He was too theatrical, too loud, too Hearst. Instead, he built castles, literal ones. The most infamous was Hearst Castle in San Simeon, California, a sprawling, fantastical estate perched above the Pacific like a Roman hallucination. It had 165 rooms, 127 acres of gardens, indoor and outdoor pools, a private zoo, and enough imported European artifacts to start a mid-sized museum. He didn't build it quietly, he hosted in it. Celebrities, tycoons, political figures, starlets, it was part palace, part propaganda studio. By the 1930s, Hearst was one of the most powerful men in America, but the tide was beginning to turn. The Great Depression hit his newspapers hard. His personal debts ballooned. The public grew wary of media moguls wielding unchecked influence. Even Orson Welles took a swipe at him with the film Citizen Kane, a thinly veiled, artistically brutal portrait of Hearst's rise and fall. Hearst tried to block the film's release. He failed. The myth had overtaken the man, and yet the Hearst name survived. The Hearst Corporation, despite its founder's bombastic style, professionalized and diversified in the mid-20th century. It expanded into magazines, Cosmopolitan, Esquire, Good Housekeeping. It acquired television stations, syndication rights, digital media. By the 21st century, the Hearst empire had become less of a family brand and more of a media holding structure. Quietly profitable, relatively conservative, and no longer tied to a single man's ego. But the echoes of William Randolph Hearst still bounce through the corridors of American media. Every sensational headline, every tabloid frenzy, every political narrative engineered for maximum emotional impact. That's the Hearst model. Still running, still profitable, still powerful. His legacy wasn't just a newspaper empire, it was a country that now struggles to tell the difference between news and narrative, between what's happening and what's selling. And while the Hearsts were mastering perception, another American family was hard at work reshaping the country's physical reality. Steel beams, rubber tires, motor oil, highways, suburbs. They didn't buy the headlines. They built the machines that delivered them. The Fords. 18. Ford. Most American dynasties rise by mastering systems, finance, land, media, war. The Fords did something different. They built the machine that turned America into a system. A loud, oil-streaked, four-cylinder machine that moved people, produced objects, and redefined time itself. If the Rockefellers lit the lamps and the Hearsts wrote the headlines, it was the Fords who put the country on wheels and made sure those wheels were affordable, replaceable, and mass-produced. It all began, as industrial myths often do, with a tinkerer in a shed. Henry Ford was born in 1863 on a Michigan farm. His childhood wasn't destitute, but it was rural, methodical, and full of machinery waiting to be disassembled. By the time he was a teenager, he was already repairing watches and designing homemade engines. He wasn't interested in tradition. He was interested in movement. His obsession with mechanics would become a philosophy, a worldview, and eventually a corporate empire. In 1903, after several false starts and business failures, Ford founded the Ford Motor Company. There were other car makers at the time, dozens in fact, but most of them built luxury machines for rich men in goggles. Henry Ford had a different vision, a car for the worker, not the gentleman. He wanted something simple, durable, and cheap enough for the man who built it to buy it. Enter the Model T, launched in 1908. At $825, it was already a bargain. But that was just the opening price. Over the next 15 years, Ford didn't just sell the Model T, he perfected its production. He introduced the moving assembly line in 1913, cutting manufacturing time from over 12 hours to just 90 minutes. This wasn't innovation. It was transformation. Work became repetition. Efficiency became gospel, and the modern factory was born. By the 1920s, over half the cars in the world were Model Ts. The United States wasn't just a country anymore. It was a highway, and Henry Ford, whether he meant to or not, had turned labor into rhythm and consumption into ritual. But Ford didn't stop at manufacturing. He wanted control of wages, of culture, of morality. In 1914, he shocked the business world by announcing the $5 workday, double the prevailing wage. But this wasn't charity, it was strategy. He wanted a stable workforce, less turnover, and employees who could afford the very cars they built. It was the first major corporate investment in what would later be called the consumer economy. He also imposed strict behavioral standards. His sociological department monitored workers' homes, spending habits, hygiene, and even marital stability. If you wanted to earn Ford money, you had to live by Ford values. And then there were his opinions, often loudly broadcasted and deeply contradictory. He detested Wall Street speculation, but ran a global corporation. He advocated for world peace while selling trucks to both sides of international conflicts. He was a pacifist with a private security force, a visionary who feared modernity, and a self-made industrialist who distrusted other rich people. He also published a virulently anti-Semitic newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, for years, one of the darkest stains on his legacy. He eventually apologized under public pressure, but the damage was done. Power may have blinded him, but it didn't silence his critics. Still, Ford's dominance in industry was nearly unmatched. When the Great Depression hit, Ford Motor Company slowed but didn't break. And when World War II began, Ford's massive Willow Run plant became the symbol of the arsenal of democracy, churning out B-24 bombers at unprecedented speed. Ford had helped invent modern consumerism and then turned around and reinvented wartime production. As Henry aged, control of the company passed through a dynasty of heirs, some competent, some reluctant, most shaped by the paradox of inheriting innovation. His son, Edsel Ford, ran the company during the 1920s and 30s, bringing style and modernization to the brand. but was constantly undermined by his domineering father. He died young, worn down by the strain of balancing vision with expectation. After Edsel, the company was helmed by Henry Ford II, or Hank the Deuce, who rebuilt the brand post-World War II and restored it to global relevance. He famously launched the Ford Mustang, symbol of mid-century freedom, and waged corporate war against Ferrari in the legendary Le Mans Showdown, a story so cinematic it eventually became, well, cinema. But the Ford legacy isn't just cars. It's urban planning, wage theory, labor negotiation, environmental consequence, and American mythology. The company shaped the landscape of suburbs, traffic jams, drive-thrus, and commuting. It helped build the middle class, and later, as globalization took its toll, it helped dismantle it too. Even today, Ford Motor Company remains one of the few legacy American manufacturers still controlled, at least in part, by its founding family. The Ford name still sits on the board, still steers the brand, still lingers in the rust of Detroit and the memories of every assembly line. It is, in many ways, the most American dynasty, born in a barn, matured in a factory, and immortalized on an interstate. But while the Fords were inventing America's motion, another family was quietly reconfiguring its scale. They didn't mass-produce products. They mass-produced retail. They didn't build highways. They monetized them. They were the Waltons. 19. Walton. If the Fords put America on wheels, the Waltons taught it how to shop while driving, and then shop again, and again, at scale. Their dynasty didn't emerge from Ivy League connections or inherited land. It came from fluorescent lights, discounted goods, and the quiet logic of selling toothpaste cheaper than the store next door. The Waltons didn't inherit royalty. They wrote the rulebook for rural capitalism and mailed it with free shipping to every zip code in the country. They were not born rich. They became rich by understanding something older than oil and faster than automobiles: convenience. It begins with Sam Walton, born in 1918 in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, the son of a mortgage banker who chased work through the lean years of the Great Depression. Sam grew up moving, hustling, and selling. Milk, newspapers, magazines, it didn't matter. His first love wasn't retail. It was volume. He learned early that in America, you didn't have to sell something expensive. You just had to sell it everywhere. After college and a brief stint in the Army during World War II, Sam bought a Ben Franklin variety store franchise in Newport, Arkansas. He ran it with relentless attention to pricing and stock turnover, and when his landlord refused to renew the lease, Sam simply moved towns and started over. The message was clear: no single point of failure. No one, not even a landlord, could stand between Sam Walton and a good deal. In 1962, he opened the first Walmart discount city in Rogers, Arkansas. The idea was simple: name-brand goods at lower prices in no-frills buildings stocked in bulk. What made it revolutionary was location. Walton didn't target cities. He went after small towns, places the big retailers ignored. His logic was as clear as his fluorescent lighting. If you put low prices where people have no alternatives, they'll never leave. He was right. By the 1970s, Walmart had become a regional behemoth. By the 1980s, it was national. By the 1990s, global. And by the early 2000s, the Waltons were the richest family in the United States, and not by a little. At one point, the combined wealth of Sam's heirs exceeded that of the bottom 40% of Americans combined. But the Walton Empire was never just about money. It was about infrastructure. They re-engineered supply chains, built distribution centers so efficient they made the Pentagon look disorganized, used early data analytics to track inventory down to the barcode. While other companies were still faxing purchase orders, Walmart had already wired its stores to real-time stock tracking systems. And they did all of this while keeping wages low, benefits minimal, and expansion relentless. Critics called it predatory. Sam called it efficient. The formula was unforgiving but simple. Cut costs, lower prices, repeat. The Waltons built their empire not on innovation but on discipline. They didn't need the next big thing. They needed the current thing, on sale, in bulk, on time. Sam Walton, for all his frugality and flannel, understood power better than most politicians. He knew that every town that lost a mom-and-pop store to a Walmart didn't just lose a business, it lost leverage. But he didn't gloat. He just drove his pickup truck to work, greeted customers, and made billions. When he died in 1992, his children inherited not just wealth, but strategy. The second generation, Rob, Jim, Alice, and John, didn't reinvent Walmart. They scaled it internationally, digitally, ruthlessly. They expanded into grocery, banking, online retail, and private label manufacturing. If there was a way to shave a nickel off a price tag, they found it. Today, Walmart Incorporated is one of the largest corporations in the world, employing over 2 million people globally. Its influence on global trade, labor practices, and pricing pressure is immeasurable. It doesn't just set trends, it defines market norms. If Walmart changes its supplier terms, entire industries shift. And through it all, the Waltons have remained mostly private, mostly silent, and endlessly strategic. They operate through family trusts, private foundations, and complex corporate holdings. Their philanthropy, most notably the Walton Family Foundation, has grown in recent decades, funding education reform, charter schools, environmental projects, and community development. Yet even their giving follows the pattern of their empire, targeted, data-driven, and often controversial. Their push into education reform has drawn both praise and suspicion. Are they modern philanthropists, or are they using charity to privatize public institutions? The answer, in true Walton fashion, depends on which spreadsheet you're reading. The Waltons don't throw galas, they throw algorithms. And in a world increasingly dominated by tech billionaires and digital disruptors, the Waltons stand apart, not because they're louder, but because they were first. Before Amazon, before Uber, before Silicon Valley turned retail into code, the Waltons turned it into scale. Not glamorous, not futuristic, just inescapable. They didn't create American consumerism. They built the warehouse where it lives. But while the Waltons were systematizing retail at the ground level, another family was building a different kind of empire, one based not on convenience, but on ideology. Less Aisle 5, more constitutional amendment. Less supply chain, more infrastructure of belief. They didn't want to sell to the public. They wanted to reshape it. They were the Kochs. 20. Koch. If the Waltons dominated America's consumer habits, the Kochs dominated its political subconscious. Where the Hearsts influenced headlines and the Mellons shaped tax code, the Koch family built an empire of ideology. A sprawling, well-oiled, privately funded machine designed not to run for office, but to redefine the terms of the American political conversation itself. This wasn't about party loyalty, it was about doctrine. A soft-spoken, heavily footnoted revolution in policy, economics, and civic structure, all orchestrated by a family that preferred foundations to microphones and influence to fame. If the Rockefellers were the architects of elite respectability, the Kochs were the engineers of systemic transformation. Quiet, relentless, and fully funded. It began, fittingly, with Fred C. Koch, a chemical engineer with a knack for combustion and a worldview forged in the crucible of early 20th century industry. In 1940, he founded Wood River Oil and Refining Company, which would later become Koch Industries, a privately held conglomerate that would grow into one of the largest and most profitable companies in the United States. Fred's early career was more international than most American dynasts. He designed oil refineries in the Soviet Union, then returned to the US staunchly anti-communist, disturbed by what he'd seen. That experience defined his outlook and seeded a family ideology built on suspicion of centralized power, an almost religious faith in free markets, and a conviction that American liberty was always one bureaucratic overstep away from extinction. That ideology would be inherited and expanded by his sons, most notably Charles Koch and David Koch, the twin engines of one of the most influential private networks in American political history. Charles, the elder of the two, took control of Koch Industries in the 1960s and transformed it from a mid-sized energy firm into a diversified titan with holdings in oil, gas, agriculture, chemicals, textiles, paper, and commodities trading. By most accounts, Charles was and remains an operational genius. He favored vertical integration, long-term planning, and ruthless internal efficiency. Under his leadership, Koch Industries grew not just in size, but in secrecy. The company stayed private, its finances remained opaque, and its influence spread far beyond its corporate walls. But Charles Koch wasn't content with running the second largest private company in America. He wanted to change how America thought about government. And so he built a parallel ecosystem, a latticework of think tanks, legal organizations, advocacy groups, academic grants, and political action committees. Some had Koch branding. Most did not. This wasn't lobbying in the traditional sense. It was deeper, an ideological endowment designed to outlast any single campaign or candidate. In the 1970s, Charles co-founded the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank aimed at promoting limited government and free market economics. In the 1980s and 90s, Koch funding quietly supported the Heritage Foundation, American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, Federalist Society, and dozens of other policy shops and legal advocacy groups. By the 2000s, the so-called Koch network had become an invisible hand in state houses, courtrooms, and congressional offices across the country. David Koch, the more public-facing of the brothers, ran for vice president in 1980 on the Libertarian Party ticket. The platform: abolish the IRS, dismantle Social Security, eliminate public education funding. He lost in a landslide, but the campaign was never about winning. It was about seeding, introducing ideas, shifting the Overton window, redefining what counted as mainstream. And over the next 3 decades, the Koch network did just that. Their influence on the Tea Party movement, climate change policy, tax reform, and regulatory rollback is immeasurable. Through Americans for Prosperity, the Kochs mobilized grassroots campaigns with big budget efficiency. Through university endowments, they placed free market scholars in key academic posts. Through judicial influence, they quietly reshaped the legal infrastructure around environmental law, corporate rights, and campaign finance. To their critics, the Kochs were oligarchs in disguise, leveraging a private empire to gut public institutions. To their allies, they were saviors of the Republic, shielding liberty from the creeping fog of collectivism. To Charles Koch, it was just philosophy meeting logistics. But even within the family, the story was complicated. The Koch brothers fought bitterly with their other siblings, Frederick and Bill, over control of the company and the direction of the family's legacy. Lawsuits flew, alliances shifted. At one point, the internal battle between the brothers looked less like a boardroom squabble and more like a dynastic war fought with accountants instead of swords. David Koch died in 2019. Charles remains at the helm of Koch Industries and its ideological satellites, though he has scaled back some political involvement in recent years, publicly distancing himself from the more tribal elements of modern American politics. And yet, the structure remains. The Koch-funded institutions didn't vanish. They became permanent fixtures. Their alumni staff federal agencies. Their case law reshapes judicial precedent. Their talking points circulate through cable news and congressional hearings. Unlike the dynasties that built skyscrapers or passed Senate bills, the Kochs created something stranger and more elusive, a political climate. You can't always trace their fingerprints, but you can feel the temperature shift. But as the Kochs quietly rewrote the rulebook of American influence, another family in Chicago was building its own empire, one part hotel rooms, one part democratic politics, and one part cultural philanthropy. They didn't want to change the system. They wanted to manage it. Their name was Pritsker. 21st. Pritsker, in the endless architecture of American dynasties, some built on bombs, others on ballots, the Pritskers found their footing somewhere between the ballroom and the boardroom. They didn't emerge from oil fields or media headlines, but from something far more middle class, far more American: hotels. A night stay, a front desk smile, a continental breakfast, and behind all of it, one of the most complex, calculated, and quietly dominant family empires in modern US history. Where the Waltons built an empire on discount pricing and the Kochs on ideological infrastructure, the Pritskers built theirs on structures: corporate, architectural, legal. They mastered the machinery of modern capitalism in a way that felt almost boring. Tax shelters, holding companies, family trusts. But behind the accountants and the conference rooms was a family that transformed itself from working-class Jewish immigrants into one of the most powerful dynastic networks in the country. They didn't just build a business, they built a portfolio of influence, property, and public identity. The story begins with Nicholas J. Pritsker, a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant who arrived in Chicago in the late 19th century. He worked hard, read voraciously, and eventually earned a law degree from Northwestern. But it was his sons, A.N., Abram, Nicholas, Jack, and Harry, who would lay the real groundwork for the Pritsker empire. They moved from law into finance, and then into the most scalable American commodity of the 20th century, hospitality. In 1957, the family purchased a small hotel chain called Hyatt House, originally built to serve airport travelers in Los Angeles. The concept was simple: accessible luxury, national branding, modern architecture, and the Pritskers saw not just a business, but a model. Over the following decades, they grew Hyatt into a global brand, turning the hotel industry into a franchised, vertically integrated machine. It was part status symbol, part cash flow generator, part real estate acquisition strategy. But unlike other hotel tycoons, the Pritskers didn't build Hyatt to showcase their name. They structured it like a financial puzzle, opaque, nimble, and deliberately complex. Much of the family's true genius came not from their brands, but from their legal infrastructure. A.N. Pritsker and his son, J. Pritsker, pioneered the use of offshore trusts, shell companies, and multi-tiered tax structures long before these tools became household terms or congressional talking points. They weren't skirting the system, they were building a new one. At its height, the Pritsker portfolio included Hyatt Hotels, Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, Ticketmaster, TransUnion, and the Marmon Group, a conglomerate of over 60 industrial companies. All of it tied together not by a central CEO, but by a network of family members acting as executives, strategists, and custodians of the brand. It wasn't a hierarchy, it was a web. By the 1990s, the family's fortune was estimated at over $20 billion. But unlike the public flamboyance of the Vanderbilts or the media magnetism of the Hearsts, the Pritskers maintained a strategic invisibility. They didn't pose for magazines, they didn't throw dynasty-themed weddings, they invested in museums, universities, and libraries. They funded architectural prizes. They made things better, or at least made them seem better. And yet, the family wasn't without turbulence. The very structure that made them so powerful, tight-knit, financially interdependent, legally entangled, also made them volatile. Internal lawsuits over trusts, disputes over control, and philosophical rifts about philanthropy versus profit began to fracture the once unified machine. The family formally began to divide its holdings in the early 2000s, distributing stakes among 11 heirs and gradually untangling the intricate system that had once kept their wealth so cohesive. But fragmentation didn't mean disappearance. If anything, the next generation of Pritskers began to emerge not just as executives, but as public figures, particularly in the world of politics. The most prominent is J.B. Pritsker, current governor of Illinois and one of the wealthiest elected officials in American history. A billionaire in his own right, J.B. leveraged his family fortune to build a political brand rooted in democratic politics, progressive infrastructure, and unapologetic state building. In office, he's pushed for tax reform, marijuana legalization, education funding, and massive public works investment, often framed not as social change, but as civic logistics. Less revolution, more restoration. His sister, Penny Pritsker, served as U.S. Secretary of Commerce under President Barack Obama, bringing her corporate pedigree into the federal bureaucracy with technocratic calm. Her tenure wasn't flashy, but it was effective, a reminder that for the Pritskers, public service was just another form of asset management. Beyond politics, Pritsker influence stretches across the cultural map. The Pritsker Architecture Prize, established in 1979, remains one of the most prestigious awards in global design. Their foundations quietly fund education reform, environmental sustainability, and urban innovation. Their name appears on buildings, wings, and centers of excellence, but rarely, if ever, in the headlines. The Pritskers are, in many ways, a dynasty of contradictions. Stealthy but influential, generous but strategic. Democratic donors who pioneered the very tools of elite wealth protection that progressive politicians now rail against. Their empire is less about dominance than durability, a modern aristocracy wrapped in Midwestern understatement. They didn't seek to control the narrative like the Hearsts or to engineer ideology like the Kochs. They simply managed reality with quiet, professional efficiency. But while the Pritskers shaped policy and taste with polished restraint, another family was turning oil into museums, boardrooms into operas, and personal excess into a global cultural brand. Their wealth was vast, their tragedies tabloid-worthy, and their last name hung on gallery walls across the continents. They were the Gettys. 22. Getty. Some dynasties build nations, others build narratives. The Gettys built something stranger, an empire of contradictions, woven from oil and art, scandal and silence, marble columns and security gates. At their height, they were the richest family in the world. But unlike the Rockefellers or the Mellons, the Gettys never fully settled into the role of stewards. They existed somewhere between mythology and dysfunction, their name carved into museum walls and whispered through generations of tabloid journalism. At the center of it all was John Paul Getty, the original oil baron, corporate architect, and anti-philanthropist who once famously said, "The meek shall inherit the earth, but not its mineral rights." He was a man who read Latin, negotiated oil deals in Arabic, and haggled over pennies while sitting on billions. Ruthless, brilliant, and catastrophically cheap, J. Paul Getty redefined what it meant to be rich and what it meant to be alone at the top. Born in 1892 in Minneapolis, Getty grew up surrounded by Methodism, ambition, and an early exposure to the oil business through his father, George Getty, who had built a modest fortune in Oklahoma. Paul attended Oxford, dabbled in art, and returned to the US with both refinement and a chip on his shoulder. By 23, he'd earned his first million through savvy wildcat drilling. By his 40s, he'd expanded Getty Oil into a global force, pioneering exploration in the Middle East and negotiating directly with monarchs and ministers long before that became standard operating procedure for American industrialists. But Paul Getty didn't just build an oil empire, he engineered a corporate dynasty, consolidating Getty Oil into one of the most profitable private enterprises of the 20th century. At its peak, the company controlled vast reserves in Saudi Arabia, held major sway in domestic refining, and quietly funneled immense wealth into offshore accounts, shell corporations, and tax-protected holdings. By the 1960s, J. Paul Getty was the richest man alive. He had all the trappings: an English estate, priceless art, private jets, and yet his image was far from glamorous. He famously installed a payphone in his mansion for guests. He scrutinized personal expenses like a cost analyst, once deducting laundry costs from his son's salary. He published books on capitalism and corporate philosophy, praising austerity while living in an actual castle. He was both Gatsby and Scrooge, an industrialist who despised waste and a collector who saw value in everything except intimacy. The cracks in the Getty facade began with the family. J. Paul Getty married and divorced 5 times. His children grew up in the shadow of a father who saw emotional support as a line item. Paul Getty Jr., one of his sons, struggled to live up to expectations. A bohemian turned businessman, he oscillated between trying to impress his father and trying to escape him. By the 1970s, the family fortune had turned into a gilded burden, weighing down generations who had inherited wealth without ever really inheriting direction. The most infamous chapter came in 1973, when Paul Getty III, J. Paul's teenage grandson, was kidnapped in Rome. The abductors demanded $17 million. Getty Sr., true to form, refused to pay. He assumed it was a ploy, another spoiled family member trying to extract funds. When the kidnappers cut off the boy's ear and mailed it to a newspaper, Getty reluctantly agreed to pay a fraction of the ransom, after negotiating the sum down and treating it as a loan to be repaid with interest. The story shocked the world, not just because of the brutality, but because of the cold arithmetic. The richest man on earth had been confronted with a crisis only money could solve and responded with a calculator. But Getty's legacy didn't end with stinginess or scandal. It ended, paradoxically, in beauty. In 1953, he created the J. Paul Getty Trust, a charitable foundation that would become the richest art institution in the world. After his death in 1976, much of his fortune was funneled into the Getty Center and the Getty Villa, 2 cultural monoliths perched above Los Angeles like temples to taste. The Getty Center, in particular, with its Richard Meyer-designed campus and panoramic views of the Pacific, became a modern acropolis of scholarship, conservation, and curated prestige. Today, the Getty name is synonymous not just with wealth, but with patrimony. Their foundation supports art conservation across the globe, funds archaeological work, and provides grants to protect cultural heritage. They became what J. Paul never quite managed to be himself: generous. But behind the marble and the philanthropy, the family legacy remains clouded. Descendants of J. Paul Getty continue to wrestle publicly and privately with addiction, estrangement, lawsuits, and the existential dilemma of inherited fortune. The Gettys never became a political dynasty. They didn't run for office or write policy memos. Their empire was one of aesthetics and oil, opulence and absence. They gave the world art collections, conservation labs, and one of the most expensive real estate footprints in philanthropy. But they also gave it a cautionary tale of what happens when money arrives without instruction and legacy without love. Still, the Getty dynasty endures, part museum, part myth, part moral ambiguity. But as the Gettys assembled their cultural empire from oil and antiquities, another family, less famous, less visible, was quietly building something even more American, a kingdom of candy. Cloaked in sugar, wrapped in secrecy, and protected by a corporate philosophy so tight-lipped it made Swiss banks look chatty. Their name was Mars. 23. Mars. In the sprawling catalogue of American dynasties, oil barons, industrialists, media tycoons, political power brokers, there's one family that has built its empire on something far more universal, far more primal, and far more addictive than all of them combined. Sugar. Sweet, profitable, and discreetly omnipresent. While the Rockefellers ran refineries and the Waltons ran supply chains, the Mars family ran childhoods, and Halloween, and vending machines, and pet food bowls, and by quiet extension, a multi-billion-dollar global empire built on chocolate bars and corporate silence. The Mars name isn't carved into universities or paraded on book jackets. It doesn't hang from skyscrapers or adorn the wings of major art museums. That's not their style. The Mars family didn't build its brand on publicity. They built it on privacy. Absolute, airtight, multi-generational privacy. While other dynasties flirted with legacy and public life, the Mars family committed to one thing, controlling everything they owned and saying nothing about it. It all began with Frank C. Mars, born in 1883 in Minnesota. As a boy afflicted with polio, Frank spent much of his childhood indoors, learning to hand-dip chocolates with his mother. By 1911, he was making candy in his kitchen and selling it door to door. After a series of failed businesses and relocations, Frank found his breakthrough in 1923 with the Milky Way bar, a fluffy, affordable confection designed to mimic a milkshake in solid form. It sold like a dream. But the family's true industrial genius came with his son, Forrest Mars Sr., a man whose personality was described by associates as demanding and by subordinates as glacial. Brilliant, competitive, and control-obsessed, Forrest would spend decades transforming a modest confectionery business into a globe-spanning empire. He clashed early and often with his father, and after a falling out in the 1930s, he left the US to establish his own operations in Europe. There, he created the Mars Bar and laid the groundwork for international expansion. When Frank died in 1934, Forrest returned to the US and eventually took over the company. From there, Mars Incorporated became the embodiment of vertical integration and corporate opacity. Forrest didn't just run the company, he engineered it. He built factories, designed equipment, oversaw recipe development, and insisted on secrecy at every level. While Hershey became a household name through branding and advertising, Mars took the opposite route. No public stock, no earnings reports, no press access. Even today, Mars Inc. is one of the largest privately held companies in the world, with annual revenues exceeding $40 billion and almost no public-facing executives. The list of Mars products reads like a checklist of 20th century childhood. Snickers, M&Ms, Twix, Skittles, Starburst, Milky Way, Three Musketeers. They didn't just sell candy, they owned the category. Forrest Mars's mantra was simple: quality, efficiency, and total control. Every step of the production chain, from cocoa sourcing to packaging, was brought in-house wherever possible. He even insisted that M&Ms be sold in separate facilities from other Mars products to prevent cross-contamination and protect trade secrets. But candy was only the beginning. In the latter half of the 20th century, Mars Inc. expanded aggressively into pet care, acquiring Pedigree, Whiskers, Royal Canin, and later the massive Banfield Pet Hospital chain. They now own a significant portion of the global pet food and veterinary market, quietly transforming from a candy company into a corporate hydra that shapes both human and animal consumption patterns. By the time Forrest died in 1999, he had established a business empire that was legendary in scale and nearly invisible in culture. The company passed to his children, Forrest Jr., John, and Jacqueline Mars, all of whom maintained the family tradition of privacy, internal succession, and no-nonsense ownership. For years, the Mars siblings were among the richest individuals in America, regularly ranking on Forbes lists, though often with no photos, no interviews, and no traceable political donations. Even today, as third and fourth generation Mars heirs hold advisory roles, sit on the board, or manage internal divisions, the company remains stubbornly opaque. It does not disclose its leadership structure. It rarely engages with the press. Executives are not household names. There are no splashy philanthropic pledges or grand museums bearing the Mars name. They are, in many ways, the anti-Gettys, just as rich, far less visible, and yet their influence is everywhere. A bag of peanut M&Ms on a gas station counter, a bowl of Whiskers in a suburban kitchen, a Halloween bucket filled with Snickers and Twix bars. Mars didn't invent sugar addiction, but they industrialized it. Critics have, over the years, raised concerns about supply chains, labor practices in cocoa farming, sugar marketing to children, and the consolidation of pet healthcare services under one corporate umbrella. Mars Incorporated tends to respond with policy statements rather than press conferences. They prefer resolutions to headlines, but therein lies their dynasty's strength. While others court attention, the Mars family has built their fortune on avoidance. No IPOs, no boardroom leaks, just generational wealth wrapped in caramel and corporate strategy coated in secrecy. Their legacy isn't public, it's product-based. Millions of transactions every day, billions of satisfied customers, trillions of calories. You may not know who runs Mars, but odds are Mars runs your snack drawer, and maybe your vet too. And while the Mars family built their quiet empire out of candy and kibble, another family, far less sweet, far more strategic, was cultivating an empire of food so vast, so unseen, and so essential that you probably ate something from them this week without knowing it. Their fortune is grown, harvested, processed, and shipped through a global supply chain few ever glimpse. Their name, Cargill-Macmillan. 24. Cargill-Macmillan. If the Mars family owned the snack aisle, the Cargill-Macmillans owned the shelves. Quietly, totally, systemically. There is no dynasty in American history, maybe in world history, more secretly embedded in your breakfast, lunch, and dinner than this one. You don't see their name on products. You don't walk past a Cargill-branded supermarket. They don't sponsor stadiums or launch streaming platforms. But every time you eat, their fingerprints are probably on your plate. Welcome to the invisible monarchy of American agribusiness. It all started in 1865 in Conover, Iowa, 2 months after the Civil War ended, when William Wallace Cargill bought a single-grain storage warehouse. Not a railroad, not a plantation, a warehouse. From that modest foothold, Cargill began trading grain along rail lines and river routes, steadily expanding into one of the most lucrative and quietly vital sectors of the American economy, food infrastructure. Over the next century and a half, the Cargill family, and later its in-laws, the Macmillans, didn't just trade grain. They structured the global agricultural supply chain, vertically, horizontally, and diagonally. They invested in shipping, storage, meat processing, fertilizer, risk management, futures trading, and commodity speculation. By the mid-20th century, Cargill Incorporated had become the largest privately held company in the United States, a distinction it still fights to maintain today. And yet, for all their size, the Cargill-Macmillans remain virtually unknown to the public. They never went public. They don't give interviews. Most Americans don't even realize the chicken nuggets they ate for lunch or the corn syrup in their soda passed through a Cargill pipeline. Processed, refined, brokered, or insured by an empire that has no logo in your fridge but owns half of what's in it. Why the secrecy? Partly by design, partly by doctrine. The company's culture has always leaned toward opacity. The Cargills and Macmillans maintain strict privacy, using a complex web of trusts and internal governance to keep control tight and generational. Unlike the fractious lawsuits of the Pritskers or the media meltdowns of the Gettys, The Cargill dynasty learned early that the best way to protect a fortune is to say nothing about it at all. They understood that in agriculture, visibility breeds regulation. Influence grows best in the dark. Over 100 family members are shareholders, but only a handful work inside the company at any given time. Leadership has long rotated between trusted family insiders and fiercely loyal executives. The Cargills understood that too much family involvement could poison the well, so they hired professionals, but kept the ownership firmly in-house. And what an ownership it is! Cargill processes roughly 1/4 of all US grain exports. It's one of the top global traders of soybeans, corn, wheat, cocoa, palm oil, and animal feed. It supplies meat to fast food chains, corn syrup to beverage companies, and ingredients to thousands of food brands. It owns shipping fleets, barges, and rail cars. It even operates weather satellites, not for curiosity, but to anticipate crop yields, harvest schedules, and futures prices. It's not an agribusiness company, it's the infrastructure of global calories. And yet, the Cargill Macmillans are barely discussed in mainstream media. They make the Mars family look like socialites. There are no reality shows, no exposés, no philanthropic press conferences. They fund museums and universities, sure. They give to food banks and hospitals, but always quietly, always structurally, not as nobles, but as network architects. But cracks have appeared. Cargill has faced criticism over the years for environmental degradation, particularly in its role in deforestation, industrial farming, and carbon emissions. Labor disputes, food safety recalls, allegations of monopolistic practices, human rights investigations, the usual symptoms of a company that's simply too big to see all at once. Still, the family holds the line. They've weathered decades of scrutiny without ever stepping fully into the public square. In many ways, they are the last of the true 19th century industrial dynasties, an empire of ships and silos ruled from boardrooms without windows. But while the Cargills built a kingdom on food logistics, another American dynasty took a very different path, shaping perception through the lens of taste. Not oil, not candy, not politics, culture, delivered through glossy pages, editorial influence, high society friendships, and a strategic reinvention of the American elite. The Annenbergs. 25. Annenberg. The Annenbergs may be the most refined dynasty to emerge from a tabloid empire. A family whose roots lie in racing forms and gossip columns, but who somehow ended up reshaping journalism, diplomacy, and high culture. If the Cargills were America's agricultural spine, the Annenbergs were its cultural nervous system, delivering messages, shaping norms, and funding the institutions that told Americans who they were supposed to be. Their story starts with Moses Annenberg, a Prussian Jewish immigrant who landed in the US in the late 19th century and climbed the publishing ranks from newspaper boy to mogul. He wasn't refined, he was aggressive. In the 1920s, he acquired the Daily Racing Form and the Philadelphia Inquirer, turning both into wildly profitable papers, one for gamblers, the other for families. Moses didn't shy away from controversy. He tangled with FDR-backed conservative candidates and was eventually convicted of tax evasion in 1939. He served time in prison, paid a then-record fine, and left his empire to his son, Walter Annenberg, who would spend the next half-century rebranding the family legacy from hard-edged profiteering to benevolent public-minded patronage. Walter wasn't just a media mogul, he was a refiner. Under his leadership, the family's publishing empire expanded to include TV Guide and 17 Magazine, two of the most influential publications in American history. TV Guide told a generation what to watch and when to watch it. 17 shaped how millions of teenage girls thought about fashion, relationships, and themselves. This wasn't journalism, it was identity manufacturing. And Walter wasn't content to stop at cultural influence. He wanted credibility, and he bought it the old-fashioned way, by giving money to every institution that might eventually write his obituary. He funded universities, most famously the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He gave hundreds of millions to museums, libraries, public media, and education reform efforts. He served as ambassador to the United Kingdom under Richard Nixon, a role that allowed him to hobnob with royalty, and finally, at long last, give the Annenberg name the patrician polish it had lacked. Walter was a walking contradiction, a Nixon Republican who funded liberal public television, a publisher of mass-market tabloids who collected impressionist art, a man who began his fortune with racetrack betting sheets and ended it as the benefactor of orchestras and Ivy League lecture halls. When he died in 2002, the Annenberg Foundation was one of the largest in the United States, with over $1 billion in assets and an expansive portfolio of education, media, and public health initiatives. His daughter, Wallis Annenberg, continues to run the foundation, steering it toward environmental and social justice causes, again, not radically but methodically, strategically. The Annenbergs never wielded power, like the Kennedys, or curated legacy, like the Rockefellers. They bought access, they shaped perception, and they understood, better than most, that in America, reputation is just another commodity, best managed with discretion, strategic giving, and excellent press. And with that, the list ends, not with a roar, but with a refinement. 25 dynasties, 25 kingdoms built on oil, ink, war, candy, corn, and cultural control. Each royal in its own way, each haunted by its own contradictions. And if there's one thing these families prove, it's this. In America, monarchy isn't abolished, it's privatized.